And what you have is a young lady who is in a suitcase deposited on a railway embankment, covered over by twigs and other foliage.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
And then you find out what really happened. You read it in books, you see it in TV shows and everything else. It's really tough. Well, there isn't a day go by that you don't remember something.
It tears communities apart.
When I arrived at the scene, the first thing I went and saw was the body in the wood.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
Homicides are the ultimate. That's the climax. That's what this job is all about.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
From a forensic point of view, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this case is that conviction was achieved without the body.
In this episode, a 33-year-old Sunday school teacher is found dead in her apartment.
A cord around the neck, unclothed from the waist down, in the bathtub. That pretty much told us murder.
The people have said that she was awesome, that she was one that you could always talk to. It's so crazy that she's gone.
Meet the murder detectives.
He had motive, he had means, and he had opportunity.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
We're wearing bulletproof vests, but we're wearing plain clothes. We're driving unmarked police cars, and that's all exciting stuff. That's what cops become cops to do.
In the Central Valley of California lies Modesto. In 2001, it had grown from a quiet town to a busy industrial city, and with it, a rise in violent crime. In March of that year, a 33-year-old female named Susan Iyer was found dead in the bathroom of her apartment in North Modesto.
It was a late Friday afternoon at the end of a work week. I was at my desk finishing up reports from other cases that I was working on, and we got a call from one of the supervisors saying a murder had occurred and we needed to go out and take a look at it.
Detective John Bueller had worked on homicide investigations for more than 12 years, but what he discovered at this crime scene shocked even him.
It was a typical small bathroom, and Susan was in the bathtub where the killer had placed her. And he had filled the tub up with water. It just looked bad. Susan was unclothed from the waist down. She still had her shirt on.
John's partner, Al Bracchini, took witness statements to discover more about the victim, Susan Iyer.
Here's a gal that is pure as snow. This is a gal that didn't have any enemies. You'd want her to be your sister or your girlfriend or your wife. I mean, this is a nice person. And so it's shocking. I mean, I came from 5 years before homicide work in gangs, and so you're constantly looking at bad guy shooting bad guy, drive-by shootings, sexual assaults and things. This is one where, you want to get justice.
They discovered Susan was a Sunday school teacher at a church out of town.
These are our Sunday school classes, and this is where Susan would have worked. To be a Sunday school teacher, number one, you'd have to love the kids. Number two, you'd have to have a fun personality, and my understanding is that Susan was really good at all of that.
This news made what they found at the scene of the crime even more disturbing.
In addition to her being in the bathtub, she also had an electrical cord around her neck. Now, it was the same type of cord that would be used for like an electric power drill or something like that. It was very obvious because it was an orange color. And, of course, a cord around the neck, unclothed from the waist down, in the bathtub, that pretty much told us murder.
The crime scene can hold a great many clues, but it does depend, actually. Was that the site where the victim was killed? It might be a deposition site, in which case it might offer different sorts of opportunities for clues. So that's a whole different set of priorities for the senior investigating officer to think about.
Local crime reporter Daryl Farnsworth had picked up the story on the police scanner and was already at the scene.
The Susan Iyer case sticks out in my mind because it was so senseless that the killer went over there and killed a beautiful young lady who was a lot of people's best friend, a daughter.
Susan was a true innocent victim. She was the proverbial virgin Sunday school teacher. She was single, she was a hard worker at the business where she was working in the office. She had a select group of friends, and they were all good people, very good Christian people.
Here in the church, when that happened, it was a huge surprise to everybody because she's not one that you'd expect would be caught up in something that tragic.
John learnt it was Susan's parents who had alerted the police.
This is the location where I was called on a late Friday afternoon. There's a stairway that goes up to a landing, and then it splits, and one of the stairways goes up to the right, one goes to the left. Susan's apartment was on the stairway to the left. When a delivery wasn't successfully made by a store to deliver a refrigerator to her house, her parents tried to reach her, and they couldn't get a hold of her. So they drove from their home in a neighboring town to Modesto. They had a key for her apartment, and they went in, and then that's when Susan's father actually discovered Susan deceased in the bathtub.
It must have been horrific for Susan's family to find her. I can't even imagine. They went over there expecting to find their daughter, and here's her body in the bathtub. It was just terrible. Can't put myself in that place. It was horrible.
Susan lived in a quiet complex of smart condos in North Modesto.
This kind of crime surprised a lot of people over here because it's not a high crime area. It's not where you would expect something like this to happen.
Nobody saw anything, heard anything. They didn't see anybody go to the apartment or leave the apartment, and there were no other problems in the complex. And for her to be murdered in that horrific way, I think other residents thought, maybe I'm next.
While talking to Susan's parents, John discovered Susan was supposed to be moving house so she could be nearer to them and her best friend.
There were boxes that were labeled. They were stacked neatly around the apartment. Things were already packed. There was very little that was left that hadn't been packed. It just didn't look like a place where a crime occurred.
Susan had never reached her new home. She was brutally murdered while packing up. John and the team searched for any clues that might lead them to a motive.
Susan's apartment was very neat and clean, even for somebody that was moving out. It wasn't dirty, and so although there was an odor of bleach in the bathroom where her body was, I couldn't tell for sure if it was bleach that was put in the water of the bathtub or if it was just a cleaning of bleach.
The CSI team took a sample of the water in the bath to be analysed for the presence of bleach.
Although bleach is a common household product, it's not expected that most people would understand the effects of bleach on a human body. This case does suggest that the individual, the perpetrator, had some higher level of knowledge.
The murder scene provided little in the way of clues for Al and John to work with. Recording every detail was vital.
Her purse was spilled out, and there was no money in it. The door was unlocked, and the bathroom door was locked.
There was a blood spot that was in the carpet of the bedroom, just steps away from the bathroom. And it wasn't a giant blood spot or anything like that, but it was noticeable. It seemed out of place because of the cleanliness of the rest of her apartment.
But they both knew the absence of evidence also told a story.
The one thing that stuck out the most early on was the fact that there was no evidence of somebody forcing their way into her apartment. And there was only one way in, the front door. So if nobody forced their way in, it puts us in a position to think that she probably knew the killer.
Susan lived a quiet Christian life in Modesto. But the city could be a dangerous place to live.
2001, Modesto was getting active, pretty active on the crime scene as the population began to swell. There was murder every week or two.
They have gangs, they have drugs, they have homicides, but they have good people too.
John and Al worked together in the homicide team for 7 years, taking it in turns to be lead investigator on a case.
The things we did were dark and they were depressing, but our work environment was very, very enjoyable because of the people that we worked with.
John Buehler, he was kind of a mentor to me. I mean, I did solve a few of his cases for him.
I was the lead on 26 murder cases I investigated with my partners over 140. When it comes to shocking murder cases, every one of them was shocking to the family members that were left behind. But in particular for us, the real shocking ones were innocent victim murders. Susan's case was one of those.
John applied his years of experience to the investigation.
On any murder case, we work the murder from the victim outwards. So if the victim is in the center of a circle, we can go in any direction like the hands on a clock from the victim themselves. So we look at the victim and we see what goes on in their life, get an idea of if there was somebody that had an issue with them or there was some confrontation that was brewing.
It makes sense to start close to home, and of course we know from statistics that females murdered indoors, the most likely suspect is actually her sexual partner or her husband or her boyfriend or an estranged partner.
Al canvassed the neighbours, taking detailed statements of what they'd seen or heard the night before.
One of the first witnesses I spoke to was a lady that lived downstairs directly below where the victim lived, and she was visibly upset.
The witness told Al there was nothing unusual when she went to bed at 11 p.m, but shortly afterwards, she heard a loud bang.
It sounded to her like a large box had fallen on the floor, and it woke her up. She said she can't be positive, but she thinks she heard a yelp, a sharp yelp. And then she heard running, heavy footsteps from the bedroom to the kitchen to the bathroom, and she could hear this from downstairs. And then she heard the water get turned on the bathtub. And then she believes what she hears is somebody coming down the stairs. She's a mess. I mean, she believes if she would have just woke up, called somebody, did something, maybe this would be different.
This information gave John and Al a time frame to work with. Susan's mother reported speaking to her at 10:30 p.m, and a neighbour heard the bath being run around 11:30 p.m.
People talk about a gut instinct, and for cops that have done the job for a while, you usually have an idea of something, and my gut instinct was, of course, that Susan knew her killer. But as far as who it would be, without talking to more people, I didn't have anything that was really pointing in any specific direction.
The hunt for Susan's killer had only just begun, but John and the team had no idea who would want to kill this innocent Sunday school teacher. In Modesto, California, 33-year-old Sunday school teacher Susan Iyer had been found dead in her flat. She was about to move to a new home nearer her parents and her church.
The people have said that she was awesome, that she was one that you could always talk to. She kept to herself but wasn't standoffish. So crazy that she's gone.
Susan's body had been discovered by her parents, and Detective John Buehler called on them at home that evening to update them.
As luck would have it, Susan's best friend was there at Susan's parents' house. We learned that Susan was going to be maid of honor in her upcoming wedding. She was going to be marrying a guy named Chris Mulvaney.
The friend's fiancé was also at Susan's parents' house.
He had said that we should look at Susan's ex because he liked weapons and he was kind of an unusual person and he could be a violent person.
Chris told John that Susan had ended the relationship 6 months ago, and since then, the boyfriend had acted strangely.
Her ex-boyfriend would be the closest one to her in a sense that maybe could be involved in this. So we knew he was important and it would have to be cleared out first. But then equally important would be those people that lived in the complex that could be involved in that.
We heard from the family that Susan was creeped out by some people in the apartment complex.
That that kind of investigation where you've got somebody who really, is a very quiet person that lives alone, that the investigation would have to start from the idea that this might be a random stranger attack. Somebody could have come to the door selling something. Somebody could have just passed by. She could have walked a different way to her church, and something there might offer a clue as to who the suspect was.
There was little evidence for detectives Al Brocchini and John Bueller to work with until the results of the forensic examination began to arrive the next day.
Because Susan had been in the bathtub full of water, the water doesn't do the body any good once you die. And so they moved the autopsy up to Saturday. It was a murder, according to the forensic pathologist, that it was probably done with injuries to the neck, and that there was other trauma to the body indicating a sexual assault. Sexual assault is a key thing in an investigation like this because it showed that the killer had some unusual interest in the victim that didn't include robbery or something like that.
John and Al now began to suspect that Susan may have been targeted for her innocence.
I probably talked to 5 people, and one of the first 5 things they tell me about Susan is, besides that she's a Sunday school teacher, a great gal, is she's a virgin. And it was something that she wasn't ashamed of. She was, I don't want to say proud, but she was waiting till she was married.
The sexual assault gave them a possible motive and the chance of DNA evidence. But the killer had used bleach on the crime scene and in the bath, which could have an impact on any forensic evidence.
If the bleach was used to, for example, attempt to clean a scene, chlorine bleach would clean away a substance like blood to the naked eye, but it would not totally destroy any evidence that would indicate that blood had previously been there.
DNA swabs had been taken from Susan's body, but John and Al would have to wait weeks for the results. In the meantime, they started to work on a profile of the killer.
This was a very personal crime, a very violent crime, where she knew the killer by letting him in.
Susan was murdered for her virginity, is what I believe.
Sex is a very defiling act. You take a virginal bride and you defile her. It's almost symbolic. So someone that proclaims their virginity and leads a very squeaky clean life would be a real target, particularly for someone who is less than perfect.
There was a killer on the loose, and John and Al had to find him before he struck again.
What I did is I just put together this list right here, and it just had the 12 people that seemed to fit into those categories of acquaintances, co-workers, and people that lived in the apartment complex that she felt a little creepy about.
Top of the list was Susan's ex. They'd been told he'd acted suspiciously after they broke up, so he was invited to come down to the station the next day.
He looked like a guy that just walked out of the waves holding a surfboard. He had kind of the bleach blonde hair.
And John had a surprise for him. He asked him to take a lie detector test, known as a polygraph.
Well, the polygraph is a machine that measures your respiration, how quickly you breathe, how deeply you breathe. It measures your pulse rate. And can it be beaten? I guess it can.
The polygrapher drew up a series of questions, then asked the subject to tell an obvious lie before moving on. By comparing readings, a lie could be detected.
So when he asked that question, did you kill Susan? He can use the earlier lie response to compare with the response for the true question that we're looking for the answer in. He passed the polygraph. He showed no deception as far as being involved in the murder, and I came away from talking to him liking him.
So if the ex was clear, why did Chris Mulvaney point the finger at him? And did the ex-boyfriend feel the same way about Chris?
I said, well, what about Chris? And he immediately said, no way, he's getting married. He's just a regular guy. I know him, he's a friend of mine. And that was interesting to me, that I got 2 separate guys where one's kind of attacking another, and the other one doesn't have anything bad to say.
That rang alarm bells for John, and he made a note to look more closely at Chris. As word spread about Susan's tragic death, the community mourned, not least those at the church where she worked as a Sunday school teacher.
She was an incredible person. She was incredibly kind. She loved the kids. She loved the people. She was a family person. It was felt throughout the church. The funeral was packed.
The shock was felt across Modesto.
Everybody's interested, all the readers in the town, everybody wanted to know what happened. And we'd get calls, hey, is there anything new on the Susan Iyer case? What's new?
John and Al had only released minimal information to the public in the hope the killer would trip himself up under questioning. In the next 48 hours, they strategically worked through their list of suspects to rule them in or out of the investigation.
I had to go back to those neighbors upstairs.
Al had spoken to them on his first day canvassing the neighborhood. One who had said he was home on the day Susan was killed now said he had gone out at the time of the murder to buy food.
I asked him if he had the receipt still. He actually did, and it showed that he got home around 1:20. And so he's kind of up in the neighborhood of that time frame.
He also told Al he'd been to see a friend the night of Susan's death, something he hadn't mentioned before.
You know, that kind of gives you a little gut check. I mean, okay, he starts out lying to me, and he's up in the time frame. He lives upstairs. The neighbor hears stuff from upstairs.
This man fitted the profile. The team had another suspect. They asked him to come in for an interview and to take a lie detector test, which he passed. That was one less suspect on the list, but there were still several to rule out.
John mentioned that he had called the victim's best friend, and he had spoken to Chris Mulvaney. Chris had some pertinent information on the phone, and so John wanted to follow up on it.
While Al interviewed Susan's best friend, John talked to her fiancé, Chris.
Susan's best friend was very helpful. I mean, she wanted to help the best she could. She also told me that Susan was seeing somebody else on the, I think she called it the hush-hush. It was somebody from work. And we had to figure out who that guy was to see if he passed muster or if he went over there or not.
With Chris, I'm acting like his best friend, and I'm acting like almost like a colleague. I need your help. Thanks for coming in. You throw a couple of compliments here because you want to continue to keep that line of communication open.
John learnt that Chris worked at a mortuary in Turlock, a nearby town, and he lived in a flat above it.
And I asked him what he thought of our victim, Susan Iyer, and he had said, well, I don't really find her that attractive. She's got a face that looks kind of like a scrunched up rat. And I just thought, this is unusual for, a tragedy like this to be referring to the dead that way.
When John and Al got together after the interview, they realised Chris and his fiancée's statements couldn't be more different.
I asked her what Chris thought of Susan. And she said that Chris had always said Susan was a nice-looking woman, and her exact quote was, "What more would a man want?" Well, that kind of just contradicts what John had learned from him. So it was something that, we can look at each other and like, whoa, what's that all about? But just another clue.
Police were asking everyone to account for their movements on the night of Susan's murder. Chris told John he'd been working at the mortuary and had gone to pick up a body with a colleague, then finish for the night. He said this could be confirmed by his fiancée.
To me, that wasn't really much of an alibi because I really didn't know if she would lie for him or not because they were engaged to be married. So I made note of it, and I knew we had to check into it a little bit more by doing some digging.
There was something else that caught John's eye. All the interviewed suspects, including Chris, had been given a cup of water.
When the interview was completed with Chris, he took that cup with him, which is not really a big deal in itself. But to compare him taking the cup when everybody else that was interviewed left their cup behind was suspicious to me. Because Chris knew that DNA trace could be found on a cup that he had put to his mouth. We checked all over the place, and we knew that he'd taken that cup when he left.
next 48 hours, the team tracked down everyone on the list.
She had a chimney sweep in there that kind of gave her the creeps. She had a maintenance man in there fixing her heater that definitely gave her the creeps.
And investigated their alibi the night of the murder.
What we're able to do is efficiently get rid of people that don't need to be investigated anymore. And as we weed out, we go from 12 down to 8, down to 4, down to 1. As we do that, we're able to put the case together because with everybody you clear from suspicion, more suspicion mounts on Chris Mulvaney.
In the suburbs of Modesto, California, 33-year-old Susan Iyer had been found dead in her bathtub. Detectives John Bueller and Al Brocchini had begun their investigation with 12 suspects, but one by one had ruled them out. They were now left with just one man, Susan's best friend's fiancé, Chris Mulvaney.
He actually made himself a suspect. He implanted himself in this case from almost the first day by trying to point fingers at Susan's former fiancé, and then from there it just kind of snowballed little at a time.
Chris worked at a mortuary in local town Turlock and now claimed that on the night of Susan's death, he'd been working.
When we did more digging into Chris's alibi, what we found is his claim actually was changed slightly.
Initially, he'd claimed while working at the morgue he had been out to pick up one body, but when re-questioned, he said he went out to collect more bodies at 11 p.m. Al went to Turlock to investigate.
Susan had a lot of friends in Turlock. Her best friend lives in Turlock. And she was going to move to Turlock the day after she was murdered.
Al had to confirm Chris's alibi, and as the mortuary used an answering service to take calls when Chris was out on a job, he went to them first.
They keep a very detailed log because they answer phones for a lot of businesses, but they know exactly the time somebody calls in, who calls in, what phone number they called from. 8 o'clock, he left to go pick up a body. And at 11 o'clock that night, he came back, called the answering service and says, "I'm back. Did I get any messages?" And they said no. And then he told the answering service, "I'm going to go pick up 3 more bodies." Then he called back at around 1:20 in the morning and said, "I'm back." So we know from, 11 o'clock to 1:20, he wasn't at the mortuary. He says he was out picking up bodies.
Susan was thought to be killed at around midnight, the time Chris said he was picking up an additional 3 bodies.
I also know that it's mandatory if he picks up a body, there has to be 2 morticians, unless he's going to a hospital. And so I interviewed his partner, who also lives here, who went with him at 8 o'clock and picked up a body and got home at 11. And he didn't know anything about any more bodies.
Chris's alibi was starting to fall apart. Al had one more interview to make that would prove Chris's story one way or another.
So I talked to the owner of the mortuary, and he said they picked up 1 body that night, and it was in the morgue by 11 o'clock, and there were no more bodies picked up. So if Chris told me or the operator or his fiancée he was out picking up bodies, he was lying.
1 week after the murder was discovered, Chris Mulvaney was our prime suspect.
As they investigated Chris Mulvaney, stories about his behavior started to surface.
Chris was involved in death in a very intimate way. Well, he would come to the coroner's office frequently to pick up bodies that had been released for the funeral home where he worked at the mortuary.
Also at the coroner's office was Christy R.U., who ran a funeral home and had had dealings with Chris in the past.
On a usual day, he was somebody that was charismatic and you could have a conversation with him. He was quite funny. He was a reasonably attractive person, well put together. But on this day, I knew that there was something wrong.
It had been the day after Susan's death, and her body was at the coroner's office.
He was starting to ask some unusual questions.
He was asking about, does water cover up evidence? And things like that. Just really inappropriate questions.
Did you find out if Susan had been raped? Now, why would anybody ask that question? He was talking to them about body position.
Chris revealed he knew Susan's body was found face down in the bathtub, a detail that hadn't been released to the public.
He knew that she was in the water. He just had details that he shouldn't have. Not so soon. I just engaged in a deeper level of conversation, like, oh my goodness, it's so sad that Susan passed away, how did you know her? He was just describing things that you wouldn't really talk about when somebody passes away, like what she looked like, how tall she was. He was very intent on conveying to me that he did not think she was attractive. And he wanted to let me know that she looked like a mouse.
He was too familiar with the case. He was too interested in the case.
He knew that she had been sexually assaulted, and I found that if your wife's best friend has passed away, you're not even going to be probably showing up to work. You're going to be at home supporting your wife. That would be usual and typical. I'm a person that exercises discernment. And when I'm talking to somebody, I can tell they're not being honest with me. Chris coming in and asking me these questions, it was absolutely outrageous. It was just outrageous, the things that he was saying.
Chris said that the reason he was asking these questions, when asked by Christy why he was so curious, is that Chris was doing this for Susan's father, because Susan's father just couldn't bear to stand talking about this. So I called Susan's father, and the first thing he told me when I reviewed this information with him is these words: "You've got your man." He never gave Chris information about how the body was positioned in the bathtub. And the only people who knew that were those of us working the case, who went on the other side of the yellow tape, and Susan's parents.
When I was talking to Chris, there was no doubt in my mind that he was the person that killed Susan. No doubt whatsoever.
Although John and the team were convinced Chris was the killer, there was still a lack of forensic evidence. Bleach had been found in the bathwater and had been used to wipe down the surfaces. Even if Chris's fingerprints were found, he'd put something in place to explain their presence.
On the original interview, Chris put himself at the crime scene. He had told me that he had been at Susan's apartment the day before the murder.
Al asked Chris's fiancée if she could confirm this was true.
She was shocked that he said he went over there because he had never gone over there by himself. I don't think she suspected anything, but she was trying to be as helpful as she could.
He went over there to discuss details on the wedding with her. Things about releasing doves and hiring a country singer to help out with the entertainment. Unbeknownst to Chris, I knew the country singer. He told me absolutely not. Nobody's called me to entertain at the wedding, and I certainly would remember it if somebody did.
John had caught Chris in another lie.
I was keeping track on all the circumstantial evidence that had come up during our investigation, and they included 41 things that pointed towards Chris Mulvaney. He knew the victim. She did not support his relationship with his fiancée. She really didn't care for him. She had told others that she didn't feel comfortable around him. He deflected suspicion away by talking negative about her ex.
John and Al had to take this circumstantial evidence to the district attorney's office. Would it be enough to get an arrest warrant for Chris Mulvaney? Or would Chris figure out they were onto him and go on the run? Detectives John Bueller and Al Brocchini had been working on the murder of 33-year-old Susan Iyer for just 8 days, and they believed they had their killer, Christopher Mulvaney, who was engaged to Susan's best friend.
Everything that we looked at in this case reveals to us that Chris used probably some sort of a ruse to get in Susan's apartment. He may have told her that he wanted to talk about plans for the wedding. Once inside, it seems likely that he tackled her on the floor, attacked her on the floor, killed her, put her in the bathtub, filled it with water, put the bleach in, and then left.
I think he went over there to kill her because he wanted to have sex with her because she was a virgin. And this was driving him crazy, apparently. And he knew he was going to have to kill her because she wasn't going to agree to it.
Susan's body had been found in a bathtub filled with water and bleach. John believed that the killer had hoped that this bleach would destroy any evidence of sexual assault, but it hadn't. DNA evidence had been found on the body.
In cases of rape, depending on where the semen would be found, if bleach was introduced to the system, for example, into a cavity, if it was oxygen-based bleach, then this is highly likely to destroy any DNA evidence. However, chlorine bleach may not, and there may in fact be DNA evidence that would persist after the fact.
John and the team took their case to the district attorney and were granted an arrest warrant and warrants to search his apartment and to take Christopher's blood to test his DNA.
He had motive, he had means, and he had opportunity because his alibi had been destroyed.
I started believing he did it when his alibi got blown up. I started believing he did it because of the guy he was. He gave the creeps to everybody. He put himself in Susan's apartment. He did a lot of things to make us focus on him. He's thinking of helping himself, but he's really helping us.
The decision was made to charge Chris, but John wanted to take this killer in quietly.
We came up with a plan where we contacted his employer at the mortuary, and we told them that we needed their help to get Chris to come in for our last interview, because we were pretty sure this would be the last interview that Chris would be involved in.
The mortuary agreed to take a call from John while Chris was at work, asking him to go down to the station. The team would then search his apartment and track him on his way to the station.
All of us that were here, we're prepared for whatever's going to happen. We're wearing bulletproof vests, but we're wearing plain clothes. We're driving unmarked police cars that all have lights and sirens. We're all armed, of course. We all have radios. We have phones. So whatever's going to happen, we're going to be able to deal with it. If he got on a freeway and started going south rather than towards the PD, we would have stopped him. We would have rammed him if we had to. And that's all exciting stuff. That's what cops become cops to do.
The phone call was placed. The employees at the mortuary went to Chris and told him that he needed to come up to Modesto Police Department to help the detectives in this heinous murder.
Chris agreed to be interviewed and decided to take his fiancée with him, Susan's best friend.
He saw him come out of the apartment, and rather than go to the work car, the hearse, he went to their personal car, which kind of raises the hair on your back a little bit because now he could run. That's why we were here.
Al and the team followed Chris and his fiancée out of Turlock and onto the freeway. To everyone's relief, they turned towards Modesto and onto the police station.
Once they arrived, John took Chris, and I had Chris's fiancée stay with another detective, and then I searched their car.
At this time, Chris still thinks that he's a helpful witness, somebody who's benefiting our investigation, and we didn't do anything intentionally to alleviate that thought. We were giving him that false sense of security that we really needed his help.
As we moved through that interview, I originally had asked him if he had a good recall of what had taken place on the day of the murder, and he told me at the start of the interview, well, of course I did. It was a traumatic thing, so I remember everything. But now I've got him committed to that right now before I even start the meat and potatoes of the interview. So as we start moving through the interview, the questions are becoming more pointed. They're more direct. And every time he would give me an answer that I already knew was a lie, I would confront him with the evidence that I had that showed he just lied to me.
You could tell that he knew he was in trouble. He wasn't liking us as much as he did. Now he was trying to think of a way out. He was kind of like a rat trapped in a cage at that point. He wanted an attorney. Well, here in California, if he asks for an attorney, all questioning has to stop.
If you're innocent, you're not going to lawyer up. You're going to try and help in the investigation.
John already had a warrant that enabled him to arrest Christopher on the spot and take him down to the hospital to get a DNA sample. Meanwhile, Al broke the news to his fiancée.
I told her you need a ride home. And she said, why? I said, well, Chris isn't going home. Chris is going to jail for the murder of your best friend.
Chris's fiancée was shocked. He had appeared to be a normal guy.
The perpetrator's ordinariness stemmed from his logical approach to life, to his struggle to maintain normality. His difficulty in doing that, to suppress his more narcissistic, more violent tendencies.
Christopher Mulvaney was a moron. Anybody who goes around killing people is a moron. He thought he was smart because he used the bleach. He thought, okay, I'm home free now, I've got this story I've concocted, and they don't have any evidence.
At that point of the investigation, we had circumstantial evidence that was weaving a nice big rope to put around his neck. But there was one thing that was missing from that rope, and that was the DNA results.
DNA had been taken from the sexual assault on Susan, and if it matched Christopher's DNA, the case would be watertight.
We're waiting on pins and needles for the DNA evidence to come back. If it came back and it wasn't Chris's DNA in there, we might have a problem with our case.
While the team waited for the DNA results, Chris went before a grand jury to decide if there's enough evidence to go to trial. He pleaded not guilty, and a trial date was set. John and Al continued to build their case.
What detectives are doing is they're trying to create a narrative ready for the prosecutor to present in court, and that's sometimes referred to as the prosecution narrative.
It was a number of months later that the DNA results came back. The summary of the results were there was one person out of 100 billion that could have contributed the evidence that was left behind on Susan, and that was Chris Mulvaney. So his I'm innocent claim went to, I'm pleading guilty to this, I don't want a trial, possibly because he didn't want to risk going and getting a death penalty.
Chris raped her, nobody else in the world but him, and so that was pretty much the last nail in his coffin.
He was given life without possibility of parole, and I remember that the judge who pronounced the sentencing on him made a kind of a unique statement. The judge told Chris that the next time that he would see freedom is after he died and was taken out of the prison in a coffin.
He deserved the death penalty, but if he's never going to see the light of day, then that's good too, because he's just sitting there in prison rotting, and there's a lot of people happy to see that, including her family, I'm sure.
Chris never would contact us to explain why he did what he did. It seems evident to me that Chris had an unreasonable fantasy about Susan and her virginity and was extremely attracted to her, knowing that he could never have this prize of being with this girl that he fantasized about so much. And the only thing that he could do that was close to that was to have his way with her and then kill her. The combination of being able to arrest him and have the DNA results confirm that he was involved in this, that was gratifying to us, but I've never yet seen anything like this that replaces that loss that the family feels.
We see a lot of darkness working homicide. I want to believe that we didn't get changed, John or me. It didn't change us. We're still the same as we were. We just saw some darkness, and we had some success, and we brought some justice.
This was a heinous case, just senseless. And he killed a wonderful young woman. Susan Iyer, she was loved by so many people.
It was right on the sidewalk where the shooting had occurred, so the shot came across 3 lanes of traffic as the car was in motion.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
It tears communities apart.
You can still speak to residents now, and they say they've never got over it or what happened to a young man in the midst of their little community here.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
That was our hope, that where we were going was going to provide us with a treasure chest of information.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
The absence of a head or hands in an investigation like this can impede identification, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible.
In this episode, 2 teenage girls are attacked and killed in the same area 2 years apart in a case that changed policing forever.
It was the biggest advancement in crime detection since the invention of fingerprinting a century earlier.
Meet the murder detectives.
When I arrived at the scene, the first thing I went and saw was the body in the wood. She'd clearly been attacked and strangled and raped.
Every male of a certain age, you looked at them and thought, was it you?
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
Retired doctors, phlebotomists, local nurses, anybody that was qualified to take blood. Yes, there was a queue at the door.
In the Leicestershire countryside lies the picturesque village of Narborough. On the 22nd of November 1983, police were called when a gruesome discovery was made.
I became involved in the case on the Tuesday morning when I received a call to say that a body had been found on a footpath at Narborough.
David Baker was made the senior investigating officer on the case.
Well, they told me that an ambulance driver was on his way to work on his bike when he went down a footpath known as the Black Pad, and he'd seen a body in a copse by the side of the footpath. So I immediately notified forensic teams and other detectives and went to the scene.
The previous night, a local 15-year-old Linda Mann had been reported missing by her parents. Journalist Alan Thompson followed the story.
She'd been reported missing by her mum the morning after she'd been out all night. Her and Linda's sister had grown concerned because she hadn't come home and contacted the police pretty much straight away.
Aware that Linda was still missing, it was important for David and the police to identify the girl who had been found as soon as possible.
When I arrived at the scene, the first thing I went and saw was the body in the wood. This was an open area with a wooden gate, which was very dilapidated, and she'd been dragged through there and then down the wood. She'd clearly been attacked and strangled and raped. And that was evident from the scene.
David quickly made the connection with the missing teenager.
We immediately contacted the relatives, and an officer was stationed with them whilst we were making inquiries at the scene.
The police weren't the only people to arrive at the footpath in Narborough. The commotion soon attracted a crowd.
There was quite a lot of press around within a very short space of time, really. Mostly local at that stage, because a murder in itself in a county like Leicestershire was not hugely significant unless it had a particular element to it. Because obviously there was a lot of forensic stuff to be done, so we weren't allowed to be very close to it.
We obviously did a forensic examination in the copse here, and then the body was removed to the mortuary for further examination.
News of the shocking discovery soon spread to the whole village.
I went to work and somebody said, have you heard the news and about a young girl being found? And I said, no, where? And they said, on the black pad. And I said, oh, when was that? And they said, she was found this morning. And I said, oh God, we came by there last night. Well, obviously it was a dreadful shock. I know everybody says you don't expect it to happen in your area, but you just don't.
Narborough in 1983 and Enderby and the smaller settlement of Littlethorpe, they were dormitory villages. A lot of people work in Leicester, travelled in, but it was communities remarkable for being unremarkable, as it were.
Narborough was a lot different to now. There weren't so many houses, there weren't so many people. It was not exactly sleepy, but people mostly knew everybody.
Around the early 80s, Leicestershire had a bit of a reputation for being a dumping ground for murder victims. So Leicestershire police had a lot on their hands.
I'd got 5 murders on at that time.
In the area where Linda had been found, David and the team wanted to make sure they could gather all the evidence they could find.
As a result of the examination at the scene, we preserved all the samples that we could and any that were loose and that before we removed the body, and it was then taken to Leicester Royal Infirmary.
They also had to examine the body for anything that might help find the killer.
In a post-mortem, in cases of rape, there are a number of samples that would be taken. Blood samples would be taken, swabs would be taken. Clothing and other physical evidence would be collected, looking for things like hairs and fibres. So a real kind of minute investigation of small details that might be present. The fingernails may be scraped as well to look for evidence that may lie beneath those.
We established at the post-mortem that she had been strangled and that she had been raped severely. There was signs on the body of violence and also defence wounds.
Linda's family were called to identify the body and confirm it was her.
There was a lot of sympathy certainly for the family when Linda's name was known, largely from the people there with families of their own. It did kind of knit people together because mums would talk to mums about their daughters, what they were doing, sharing lifts, making sure they got home, whereas before they might have quite happily let them walk.
With the community on edge, David and the team began to trace Linda's last movements in order to discover who might have seen her.
We also established that around about the time the girl had left home, there was a scream heard by some residents in a nearby house to where the entrance of the footpath was.
A friend of mine, when she and her sister were walking through the field where the murder supposedly took place, heard a scream, and they'd got their grandchildren with them, and the little boy ran off and he came back and said to his gran, I've just seen a girl and a boy in the field. She said, as we got closer, the man stood up and put his coat on, but we walked straight by. But the next day, we heard that a girl had been murdered in that field.
Several people heard the scream and the police were called. They took a description of the man seen in the area.
It was fairly evident that the girl had not got very far from the home before she was attacked and dragged into the field where the footpath was.
The police were beginning to get a clearer idea of what had happened on the night Linda was killed and set up an incident room.
Linda lived on the estate behind me, and she would have walked along this footpath to go straight ahead. See these buildings here? They were part of the hospital, and we took them over as an incident room. And that's where we had the first incident room on the Linda Mann case.
From this incident room, David set about searching for witnesses who may have seen Linda.
We set out our inquiries into the villages with house-to-house inquiries in Narborough and Enderby. so we had a wide area to cover looking for potential suspects.
With a 15-year-old girl strangled and dumped in a ditch, we're talking about somebody who is a kind of borderline paraphilic individual with a need to dominate. This perpetrator was possibly a borderline paedophile. This was probably, a happily married man living very locally.
We brought officers into the area and they covered all of the houses in the villages of Enderby and Narborough. I mean, there was upwards of 50 or 60 officers initially, including the search team, who were, for the next 6 months, knocking on doors, interviewing suspects.
Such a large police presence in the village again attracted a lot of attention.
Well, obviously it was a big story, it was a massive story, it was a front page story.
Our inquiries were quite disappointing because there was very little information came in about anybody seeing Linda after her leaving home. There was just this scream. So the information that we got in respect of Linda was very limited.
With the police inquiry getting nowhere in the villages, the local people remained on edge, fearful of a killer in their midst.
Every male of a certain age, you looked at them and thought, was it you?
This crime affected the local community. As with many communities where these crimes take place, that people look to their own, and doors are closed, and people are kept indoors. This was a small village. This was incredibly intense. And that fear also starts to create suspicion because it's patently obvious that person is local and people will get suspicious and start pointing fingers and gossip may arise. Also, that fear keeps people off the streets, which means that there's fewer eyes of witnesses out there in case it happens again.
David had used every possible resource to gain any information that might help catch the killer.
We used the press. We put out a photograph of a police officer dressed as Linda, those sort of things. But we got no feedback about anybody that had seen the girl after she left her home.
People wanted to hear it, not for salacious reasons, but they wanted to know as much as they could about the hunt for the killer and had he been caught, were there any arrests made.
We had a lot of support from the people in the villages because they were concerned. Their daughters were out and about in the villages in the evenings and of course it restricted their activities and of course raised concern with parents and they cooperated with us as much as they could. During the investigation there was obviously a lot of suspects, but they were eliminated and alibied out, and we really didn't have a suspect who really came into the frame.
1 year on from Linda's death, her killer was still at large.
The police themselves had started to wind down the investigation by the summer of 1984. Yeah, people were getting very scared. The people of Linda's age were becoming very wary. Their parents were becoming anxious, neurotic about their children's safety. It was not a good atmosphere at all. It was, people were worried, very worried.
In 1983, a 15-year-old girl, Linda Mann, had been found murdered on a path between Leicestershire villages Narborough and Enderby. Police had been unable to track down the killer.
Due to the lack of information coming in, clearly the inquiry wound down and it was left with probably half a dozen officers chasing up information and anything that came in.
If we think back to the 1980s, there wasn't such things as CCTV. There wasn't the use of a mobile phone, so we didn't have that technology which we were able to use in an effective way during an investigation. But also, communities were very different then. They weren't as transient as they perhaps are today. So that in itself would have created some community tension, because if somebody has been killed in their local area, then communities would think, well, actually the killer is within our population.
We didn't always have it in our minds, but those of us with girls, daughters, we were always aware, and I think we did behave differently. We took extra care, we wanted to know a bit more about where they were all the time.
As the community began to relax, in the summer of 1986, another teenage girl was reported missing in the area.
On Thursday the 31st of July in 1986, we received a report from Mrs. Ashworth that her daughter had not returned home.
Dawn had failed to return to her home in Enderby, which, given Linda's murder 3 years earlier, just took things to a new level in terms of the concern that was in the community and the horror that grew.
Head of CID David Baker and his team immediately began a search of the area.
This is the entrance to £10 Lane, and this is where Dawn Ashworth was making her way back home, having visited a friend's house, which is on the opposite side of the main road. And of course, when she arrived there, they weren't in, and so she turned round and came back. We continued the search on the Friday, and on the Saturday, a dog handler was carrying out a further search near fields near to the motorway, and he came across a leather jacket, which was one of the parts of the clothing that Dawn was wearing when she left home. He then carried out a further search of the field and discovered the body in a hedgerow. Dawn's body was in the hedge in the centre there, covered with hay and stinging nettles. The hay had been mown, but was left lying on the field.
When Dawn's body was found, there was an air of disbelief about the place, about the community, among the police themselves, thinking they'd got a double killer on the loose, unofficially speaking, of course, and it just blew everything up to a different level.
Linda was killed in November, and it was the coldest night of the year, and there was no attempt made to conceal the body. Dawn, in comparison, it was in the height of summer, and there was a distinct attempt to conceal the body by covering it with grass and nettles and what have you.
I couldn't believe it had happened again. People were obviously saying, well, is it the same man? There were so many questions and no answers because people didn't know.
Having that second homicide that detectives believe was connected to the first would have actually been helpful, because now you've in a sense got two sets of crime scenes, you've got two victims' bodies, and the opportunity for forensic clues is increased, obviously, but also opportunities to try and work out what suspects were in these areas at the right time.
We became concerned when the body was found that there was a serial killer at large. Two girls missing in the same area, both strangled and brutally raped, and there were signs that the two offences were connected.
With the second body, it becomes obvious that the perpetrator has to be a local man. It has to be someone who knows the area, someone who knows where it's safe to run, where it's not safe to run, and someone who knows when they're basically being able to intimidate somebody who is also local and make sure they never tell the tale.
Once we heard about the second murder, we did act differently because the police didn't seem to have any idea of who it could be. So everybody was looking at everybody, especially the males of a certain age, because that's who the police were pinning their hopes on.
Police were searching the vicinity and had set up a mobile incident room near to Dawn's home.
And one of the houses facing is where Dawn lived. Obviously the family no longer live there now, but that's where she started off her journey, and she would have walked down to the left, which we're going.
A member of the public contacted the police to say they had found a motorbike abandoned near to where Dawn was found.
Well, this is the place where the young man's motorcycle was found parked. He was nowhere to be seen in the vicinity.
Local people were now reporting anyone they had seen acting suspiciously at the time of Dawn's murder.
We received information that a young man who lived the other side of the village of Enderby had been talking about the body being found in £10 Lane, and we established that this was on the Friday before the body was found on the Saturday, and he significantly drew attention to himself.
David and his team linked the motorbike and the youth and called him in for questioning.
Within a month of Dawn's murder, in August 1986, a 17-year-old was pulled in by the police, and I remember going to a press conference where the then head of CID said they were 300% certain they'd got the killer. The reaction in the community when a local man was arrested and charged was one largely of relief.
He was charged and held in custody and put before the next available court. His solicitor was present, and we also obtained samples from him.
The suspect was charged with the murder of Dawn Ashworth after blood tests showed he had the same blood group as samples found on the body.
There was a great deal of confidence in the police that they had their man. The head of CID, Dave Baker, an exceptionally careful man, approached his chief constable despite the fact they had circumstantial evidence against the man.
David wanted to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the suspect was their killer. He had heard that Dr. Alec Jeffreys at Leicester University had developed something called DNA fingerprinting that he was using for paternity testing.
DNA profiling is commonly referred to as DNA fingerprinting because the characteristics that are assessed are thought to be unique, as in a fingerprint.
I was aware of work done by Sir Alec Jeffrey in connection with DNA research, and it was a case of the blood group being down to the individual as opposed to a percentage of the population.
David took the semen samples obtained from Linda and Dawn's bodies and established that both had the same DNA fingerprint present.
This came back to me from Sir Alec saying that one man was responsible for the murder of both girls.
They then compared that to the DNA from the blood taken from their suspect. He was not a match.
It was quite a blow for us to confirm that this young man was not the murderer of either girl.
We're all subjected to stereotypes, and sometimes somebody looks like a suspect when they really have absolutely nothing to do with it. I suppose they do have stereotypes of how people should act as suspects, as witnesses, as victims, and sometimes if you don't fit neatly into that box, then it might ring alarm bells for detectives, and sometimes that alarm bell system works well, but at other times it can lead you down a path where you're actually accidentally implicating the wrong suspect.
He was released from custody in November 1986. So he'd been in custody for 2 or 3 months, and although he'd made other admissions about other offences, these were not proceeded with in view of the time that he'd spent in custody.
People couldn't believe it, but all of a sudden that comfort blanket was taken away again. They thought the police had got the man who was responsible, and now all of a sudden they hadn't.
Their prime suspect had been cleared by the groundbreaking technology they had hoped would prove him guilty. But David and the team were still convinced DNA fingerprinting could be used to catch the killer.
Dave Baker, the head of CID, had a great belief and trust in Alec Jeffreys' technique and Alec Jeffreys as a man, decided that he needed to do a very extensive sampling of just over 4,500 men aged between 17 and 34 living in Enderby, Narborough and Littlethorpe to rule in or rule out those individuals.
Leicestershire police were about to undertake something that had never been done before. DNA testing a whole community in the hope of catching a killer. In 1986, Leicestershire police had used the cutting-edge science of DNA fingerprinting to prove that the same person had killed teenagers Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, less than 3 years apart.
After the second murder, of course, people's awareness was heightened even further than it had been after Linda's murder, to think there was 2 young girls now dead. I recall the police putting on more reassurance patrols, as they call them, having more of a visible presence in the villages, as well as the detectives. Yeah, it did affect lives.
Going back into 1980, murder investigations were much bigger than they perhaps are today. You know, the idea, I guess, was that the area would be swamped with police officers. The pure logistics of it would have been very challenging and very difficult.
The police had arrested a man in connection with Dawn's murder, but DNA testing had proved he was not responsible.
It was quite a blow for us to confirm that this young man was not the murderer of either girl. And of course we had got to set out our investigation again, but with more impetus, bearing in fact that we knew that one man was responsible for both murders, so we'd got a serial killer out there, and we firmly believed that he was still a local man.
One of the ways in which DNA was critically important was eliminating an innocent suspect fairly early on in the investigation, a suspect who had, implicated himself in one of those murders, but was in fact completely innocent. And so it's equally powerful in eliminating innocent suspects as it is in implicating the guilty much of the time.
We came to a conclusion in November that in order to take the inquiry further on, we should use the DNA and sample the community with a view to finding the individual who is responsible for these 2 murders.
The police knew it wouldn't be popular in every quarter when they'd said they were going to take blood samples from every man between 17 and 34 who lived within the 3 villages. But working on the basis that most people within those communities would see it as a good thing because it would finally rule in or out a member of their community.
The police planned to do blood testing in all 3 villages near the murder sites.
They were having officers put letters through people's door, but everybody was notified that every man of that age group, 17 to 34, was required to give a sample.
We sent out letters to various members of the public with a request that they attend the particular session and they bring with them a photograph or passport or driving licence. And of course it was a sample of blood then, not just a smear or a mouth swab. It was a full-blooded sample. It was purely voluntary, and of course the community realised the significance of what we were asking.
This is the first instance where this mass profiling was actually implemented across a very large number of people. This would have taken a huge amount of time, not only to collect the samples themselves, but also to process the samples.
Now, in order to facilitate the blood sampling, we set up centres in the villages of Narborough and Enderby.
The blood testing centres were run by a local network of volunteers and were busy from the start.
Retired doctors, phlebotomists, local nurses, anybody that was qualified to take blood. Yes, there was a queue at the door.
I think by and large there was support for it. It's hard not to support something that may end up catching the killer of 2 teenage girls.
Alongside the blood tests, detectives were continuing to carry out door-to-door inquiries.
The police came round to interview our son, who was at school. They said if they needed, they would come back. They spoke to my husband, but he was outside of the age range that they were testing at the time, so he didn't have to give blood.
Men from across the region were all called to the testing centres to have blood taken in the hope of finding a match with the DNA found on the two murdered girls.
People were looking at their neighbours, people they might not have been entirely sure about, but innocent of everything but looking a bit strange. Yeah, there was a lot of unease, uncertainty, distrust, I think, growing, and sort of people wrapped their arms even more tightly around their children to stop them becoming the next victim. Yeah, it was not a good time.
The tests revealed that anyone who was not the same blood group as the killer was immediately in the clear. If there was a match, the blood was sent for DNA analysis.
Now, red blood cells themselves don't actually contain any DNA. The DNA itself is housed within the white blood cells. This DNA can actually be used as a reference sample compared to samples from other origins. So it could be a blood sample compared to a semen sample, for example.
We got results back in about 3 to 4 weeks. At those days, it wasn't a fast service.
With the male population of 3 villages to test, they kept the mobile units running for as long as it needed to get a result.
All their eggs were in one basket with the area that they were testing, and they had to brace themselves for the fact that they may not find the killer. In fact, there was 4,582 samples taken they'd finished without the killer having been caught.
We were consistent with the blood sampling right through until August of 1987.
In one way, it's a very simple decision, isn't it? We're just going to take DNA for everybody. That's the answer, and then we'll identify who's done it, which sounds really simple, but so challenging, so very, very challenging. And it was a brave decision. I would imagine a lot of thought went into that decision, but ultimately, if every other line of enquiry had come up negative, that's all you're left with, so that's all you're going to be able to do.
David and his team had been taking blood samples for 10 months. So far, all of the tests they had completed were negative.
It was then in August that we had a breakthrough, and we realised that we'd got an individual who'd taken a blood sample for somebody else.
A local woman contacted police to say she had some information she felt was important.
She had had a conversation with a man named Kelly, who said that he had taken a blood sample for a man named Pitchfork. Immediately we checked our system and found that Pitchfork had in fact had an invitation to attend and ostensibly had attended and given blood. Of course, we then established that Pitchfork and Kelly were very much suspect to our inquiry.
The man who had asked Kelly to take his blood test for him was local cake decorator Colin Pitchfork, who lived in Littlethorpe.
This general area where Pitchfork bought his house and was living at the time of the 2 murders.
Pitchfork would never have popped up on anybody's radar. Wife who knew nothing of what he was doing, 2 small children. I believe she announced the night he came back from killing either Linda or Dawn, she announced she was pregnant with their 2nd child.
Police quickly moved in to track down these 2 men.
We immediately did background enquiries on both Kelly and Pitchfork, and within 24 hours they had both been arrested, and as a result of that were taken to the police station and questioned, and both admitted they had conspired in this blood sampling.
Pitchfork's record showed that he had been a flasher, exposing himself to more than 1,000 women.
Kelly had no criminal record. Pitchfork, we established then, had convictions for indecent exposure, but they were as a juvenile.
Exhibitionism is one of those anonymous sex crimes where you maintain distance from your victim. Basically, you want to fantasize, you want to impose your fantasy on the victim. They become whoever you want them to be. In the case of moving from exhibitionism to murder, that anonymity will still be there. They want to fantasize about this body, but they don't want to interact with it and reveal it to be an individual person. So there is absolute continuity. between the exhibitionism seen earlier and the manner of the killings later.
Pitchfork was the main concern when the information came through. I mean, he was the man that had had his blood given by somebody else.
By avoiding giving blood, Pitchfork had become the prime suspect in this case. It looked like the police had found their killer. In order to track down the killer of two teenage girls, Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, police had been taking blood samples from most of the male population in the villages of Narborough, Littlethorpe and Enderby.
No one living outside of the immediate area of those three communities was tested.
When taking blood samples in the community, the police had asked men to prove their identity, but Colin Pitchfork, with the help of Ian Kelly, had somehow fooled the system.
We knew from the outset that there would be people who would endeavour to mistake in the samples, and that was one of the reasons why we insisted on the passport or the driving licence.
Kelly had shown Pitchfork's passport when he went to give blood, pretending to be him.
Kelly gave a sort of lame excuse for taking the passport because he suggested that Pitchfork had already given blood for somebody else who was frightened of the needle, and so Pitchfork asked him to give blood for him, but it was rather a lame excuse.
After the men were arrested, police seized the passport and discovered Ian Kelly's photograph had been pasted over that of Colin Pitchfork. Pitchfork was questioned about the murders of both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth.
The interviews with Pitchfork were conducted by experienced officers who went through his actions at the time of both murders.
We didn't know Pitchfork had been arrested until the police were absolutely sure, and there was no doubt. Given that the DNA testing was a brand new system, never before tried in a court of law, they needed to be not 300 but 3,000% sure that they got the right man before they announced it. They were desperate to announce it, to show that their efforts had worked.
In the interview room, Pitchfork admitted everything.
At the time of the first murder of Linda Mann, it was on an evening when his wife had gone to a night school, and he decided to have a ride round in his car and see who he could see. Now, the only trouble was he'd got a young baby, and so he put the baby in the car seat and drove round. Because he was in the process of buying a house at Littlethorpe, he was in the Littlethorpe-Narborough area, and as he drove up the road, he saw Linda Mann walking in the same direction that he was going. So he went a little bit further up the road and parked his car at an offshoot of the hospital. He accosted Linda and dragged her into the area of the Black Path where he killed her.
The perpetrator in this case was clearly an opportunist. He just waits for that occasion when someone is out on their own, they fit his fantasy target, and he can't see any witnesses or the likelihood of any witnesses coming along. And then he's very efficient in general at targeting them, bringing them down, and having his way with the body, and then returning seamlessly to his everyday life with his son in the back of the car, who basically would be one of the best alibis you could have.
The story Pitchfork told fitted the evidence police had found at the time of Linda's murder. Pitchfork went on to describe the night he killed Dawn.
As far as Dawn was concerned, he was on his way home from work to Littlethorpe, and as he drove along the main Narborough Road, he saw Dawn cross the road and walk up 10 Pound Lane. He parked his car and followed her, and that's where he attacked her and killed her. He didn't actually admit a motive, but I mean clearly his motivation was of a sexual nature.
I think some of the reasons why some murderers never tell detectives why they killed the victim, in some instances because they're still denying that they were responsible, of course, so they're not going to say why because they're saying they didn't do it. But in those cases where they have ultimately confessed, I think they're either trying to control that piece of information, it's the one bit that they'll keep to themselves. Perhaps they don't know, perhaps they genuinely aren't certain what their motivations were. It was a complex mix of different sorts of emotions and they can't articulate it clearly even in their own minds.
After almost 4 years and thousands of blood tests, the police had finally found their killer. Colin Pitchfork was charged with the murders of both Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann.
Pitchfork was charged at court with 4 offences. One was an indecent assault on a 15, 16-year-old girl before the murder of Linda Mann. Then before the murder of Dawn Ashworth, he'd also accosted another girl and taken her in his car, but she managed to escape. But that was in an area away from Narva and Enderby. Well, he was able to come back to reality, if you like, and show no other indications of his condition. You know, his behaviour was the norm for a psychopath.
The man who had taken the blood test for Pitchfork, Ian Kelly, was charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Both men faced trial at Leicester Crown Court.
The trial of Colin Pitchfork began in January 1988, and he admitted both murders, which at least spared the families hearing through the probably gruesome police evidence that there would be surrounding the discovery of their girls' bodies.
The plea of Pitchfork was actually guilty, so the DNA evidence itself was never actually presented in court.
If he hadn't admitted it, his DNA would have proved his guilt anyway, because we did a blood test on his sample and of course that came up positive in the murder of both girls. So I mean, the result was inevitable.
Ian Kelly also admitted his part in aiding Pitchfork in attempting to cover up his crimes.
Kelly was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice.
Pitchfork admitted the murders of the 2 girls. He was given life sentences for each of their murders. He was given 10-year sentences for rape, a shorter sentence for perverting the course of justice by having someone else take the test for him.
David and the team had successfully caught their killer, but inadvertently, they had also changed the way all future murders would be investigated.
It was incredible because it was such a breakthrough in criminal investigation, which had been brought about by 2 of the quietest, most modest individuals you would ever have come across. Alec Jeffreys, such a self-deprecating man, David Baker, a highly intelligent investigator of crime, and together they developed an enormous respect for one another that brought this huge breakthrough in the world of criminal investigation.
It's quite a remarkable story in the Colin Pitchfork case that the detective happened to have read about something that was happening in his local university that was being developed around DNA that of course wasn't really and hadn't at that stage been used in a criminal investigation. It was being used more for paternity testing. But he had the idea that perhaps something could come of this, and together those 2 individuals, the scientist and the detective, you know, made huge use of something that became critical evidence in that case, of course.
There was quite a sort of slow burn reaction to the news that this technique had worked, because nobody could quite believe it. It was the biggest advancement in crime detection since the invention of fingerprinting a century earlier. But it didn't bring back the girls, but it stopped him, maybe, moving on to any others.
It was a great relief when Pitchfork was caught. It was a relief for many people, including the family, the community, and of course the officers that had worked on the inquiry.
The girls would now have been lower end of middle-aged women, probably with their own children, possibly with grandchildren. Everybody who was in that same age group, in that position, I'm not saying they'll think of them every day, but there will be times when they will cast their thoughts back. I don't think the community will ever forget
She was in the bathtub where the killer had placed her. It just looked bad.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
It tears communities apart.
You can still speak to residents now, and they say they've never got over it. They still feel deep sorrow at what happened to a young man in the midst of their little community here.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
That was our hope, is that where we were going was going to provide us with a treasure chest of information.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
The absence of a head or hands can impede identification, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible.
In this episode, the body of a woman is found in a suburban part of Nottingham.
I came out of the door, and this girl was actually lying on the doorstep. She looked asleep, she looked quite peaceful.
Meet the murder detectives, who reveal how they caught the killer.
She crossed the road from here. What we then see is an image of the offender looking across the road towards her.
You have one chance to get that evidence. If you miss it, if you lose it, it's gone forever.
In the city of Nottingham, on a Sunday morning in July 2011, a body had been found in a suburban street.
I was at work this particular morning and the body had been reported to the police and paramedics had attended. A young female, we didn't know who she was at that time, and she's in an alleyway, and clearly the family that lived adjacent to where she was found hadn't got a clue who she was and how she got there.
Senior Investigating Officer Tony Hayden began a homicide inquiry. The person who had called the police was Christine Fletcher.
I got up in the morning, usual having breakfast, and my husband said to me, "Did you hear anything last night?" And I said, "No, why did you?" And he said, "Yes, someone's shouting." But he thought it was somebody just walking past. And that was it. And then as I came out, I was going to work that day, and I came out of the door, and this girl was actually lying on the doorstep. And at first I thought she was asleep. She looked asleep. She looked quite peaceful. And I said to my husband, "I think somebody asleep on the doorstep." And he came over, and then he felt her and said, "I think she's dead." So I immediately went inside and phoned 999.
Detective Sergeant Mark Petrovich was part of the major crime unit assigned to the case.
It's rare that you'll get a phone call like that in the morning to say, "I've just discovered the body of a young female in my garden." So uniformed police officers attended the scene very quickly, and we spoke to that member of the public who'd reported the discovery of the body and took down as much details as we possibly could.
With officers already at the scene, SIO Tony needed to decide on his next steps.
I just began to assess exactly what I'd got from the information that I'd received from the scene, rather than travelling there directly. It was relatively early that I contacted the coroner because I suspected we'd need to do something unusual in this particular case, and I needed permission to call out a Home Office pathologist to join me at the scene. I set out some initial inquiries and then I travelled to the scene myself.
One of the Home Office pathologists assigned to the case was Dr. Stuart Hamilton.
At that point, when the body is discovered, literally all we really knew was that a young woman's body had been found in an alleyway. That in itself is suspicious. As time goes along, the investigations will reveal more information, but pretty much you've got a very open field of what could have happened.
The area of Nottingham where the body had been found was a quiet residential street.
Thornywood Mount here goes to Mapley. Mapley's quiet. St Anne's is mayhem. It's very, very quiet here. But it's that thoroughfare between an area that's got problems and an area that's very nice.
Rebecca Sherdley is a local crime reporter who picked up this case early on.
In Nottingham,
Obviously there's a level of crime, there's different types of crime. I see different court cases at the Crown Court involving quite brutal murders, rapes, child sex offences, but random attacks by strangers on women, that's rare.
So as I arrive at the scene, the area's been cordoned off, and that's my first role really, is to make sure everything is okay. I waited for the Home Office pathologist before I went anywhere near the body.
The scene was very busy, and the whole area ground to a halt.
The paramedics and everybody came to the house, and literally they closed off the road, and it was closed all day. I actually went off to work because I couldn't do anything. And when I came off at night, I had to get off the bus 2 stops before I normally get off, and have to go through the cordon to get back to my house.
The paramedics had attended, and they'd done some initial signs of life investigation and really pronounced her dead. The initial officer that had attended had given an account to my detectives along the lines of what she was wearing, and that there was a little bit of blood on the pavement area between the 2 houses. What first struck me is that this is an area that's so normal, so natural, and to see a young female that was clearly dead in the alleyway here was just quite a shock. But once you get over that, you then have to begin to think, what am I going to do when I start to investigate the death? There was a lot of cars on the road, and one of the things that I considered was, had she been hit by a car? So I wanted to examine all these vehicles. Are there going to be fingerprints or DNA on a vehicle that will be significant?
It was just shock, because no one knew who she was, and no one knew why she was in that area. I thought she was about 16. She looked like a very young girl.
Happy the scene was secure, Tony and the pathologist approached the body.
We would have stopped here and had a good look round this area first. Her head was at this end. She was about 10 feet up. She was in the fetal position. This was one of those cases where I didn't really understand what had happened. When we began to look at her body, it was clearly evident that she had had a child. So that kind of indicated to us that she was maybe a bit older than we initially thought. She'd got some tattoos with names on, so again that was important. I fed that back very, very quickly to try and identify her.
The key things at the crime scene were that, first of all, we have a young woman with injuries. That's automatically telling you there's a very good chance this is a homicide. At that point, you're going to do initial samples, initial tests, looking for fibres, looking for trace evidence.
Trace evidence refers to materials that can be transferred during a crime. And this could be anything from gunshot residue, it could be human hair or animal hair, fabric fibres, fibres from rope, fragments of glass, all manner of things can constitute trace evidence.
As we began to look externally initially at Caroline's clothing, it was all intact.
As the initial undressing of the victim went on, it was clear that her underwear had been disturbed. So we're now moving from simply what's likely to be a homicide to what's likely to be a sexual homicide.
With a sexual motive identified, a picture was beginning to form of the attacker.
The fact that her clothing was moved as opposed to being torn off or completely ripped off shows that actually he was, in his mind, extending a level of courtesy to her. It's very likely that he asked her during the course of the attack to go along with what he was doing.
For many people, it would seem that the victim's body was left at the scene for quite a long time, and in some ways it was. The thing is that, particularly when you're looking at what could be an assault by a stranger, you don't know what evidence is going to be important, and trace evidence, blood patterns, all of these things can be very easily lost if you try to go in and move that body too quickly. You have one chance to get that evidence. If you miss it, if you lose it, it's gone forever.
I was not going to encroach on her body in any way. I did go very close, I got down and had a real good look. There was absolutely really nothing to pick up. Nothing was left, no debris. I knew she'd got a shoe missing. So that was my first priority, is where was her shoe? So all these houses and all these gardens were all searched on that first day.
While the scene where the body was found wasn't presenting any clues as to what had happened to this woman, the forensics team were hoping that the post-mortem would.
That post-mortem was crucial to our investigation. It appeared there'd been a struggle and some clothing had been moved, including her left breast being exposed. So straight away we were thinking this was a sexually motivated attack.
With this victim, we have bruising on the arms. That looks like somebody has tried to restrain her. And we do have bruising on her knuckles. She has probably punched something or someone. These are little bits of evidence that can build a picture of somebody who's trying to get away from an assailant. And it puts everything into the context of what's happened is not a simple accident, not something consensual that's gone wrong. It's somebody who is literally fighting for her life.
In Nottingham, England, early on a Sunday morning, the body of a woman had been found outside a house in a suburban street. She had been sexually assaulted.
One of our priorities was to identify who this person was that had been found dead. We checked all the missing persons reports. That was negative. We checked all the messages from members of the public that were ringing in, and that was negative. So it was a real mystery as to who this person was.
Once the scene of crime was cleared of evidence, the body had been sent to the mortuary for post-mortem.
The key findings at the initial post-mortem examination were that there were a considerable number of external injuries. In this case, the other thing that was useful to find was that the victim had tattoos, one of which had 2 names on it. And that potentially is going to help you link a body to a family.
As the team in the office attempted to identify their victim, a man came into the station to report a missing person.
I was at St Anne's police station when the partner of Caroline Coyne attended the police station to report that she had been missing from home from the previous evening. And he gave me descriptive details of tattoos that Caroline had that very quickly we believed to match the body that we'd discovered.
As the family liaison officer on the team, Mark was tasked with breaking the news.
One of the most challenging parts of being a family liaison officer is to tell a family member, in this case, Caroline's partner, of the death of their partner. They, at that moment, do not know. They're hoping for the best. She's gone missing. They were hoping that she'd return home by a certain time. She hadn't. It then rolled on to seeing her mother and the rest of the family and passing on that information on to them as well. The reaction from Caroline's partner on delivering the message was one of sheer devastation. He had a little inkling that something wasn't right, but no way did he think that she'd been killed.
As Caroline had been identified, Tony put out a public appeal for information at the end of day 1.
The first thing that I found out about a woman's body being found in Nottingham when the police began to appeal for witnesses.
The next day was horrendous. We woke up, pulled back the curtains, and the whole road was just full of media. Now, they did warn us about this. They said, if you want to go away for a few days. And we just thought, it won't be anything. It'll just be like local news or something. Didn't sort of expect all that. But, there was everybody there the next day from the papers.
She was a care assistant, so there was quite a heartfelt response from the company where she worked. But I think most people were just reeling from the fact that this young woman had died so callously and alone in a pathway in an area of Nottingham that had never seen that sort of crime before.
There was flowers all outside the house. That was quite wrenching, and some people did knock on the door and say they were relatives of Caroline, and they just came to see where it had happened. So it was a very sad time.
Now Caroline had been identified, Mark began the delicate task of finding out where she had been that night.
From speaking to the family, Caroline's family, we'd established that she'd been to a family party where they'd had a few drinks, and Caroline had decided to leave that party and to go elsewhere. The family weren't aware of where she'd actually ended up, and it was then a case of us piecing her last movements from when she left the family home to where we'd found her. That involved extensive trawls of CCTV around the Nottingham city centre area.
The officer coordinating the search for video evidence was CCTV investigator Pauline Austin.
The details went out, as I believe, on the news that day, and I believe that it was a transport officer in the city who told us that on the previous evening their bus was going up Porchester Road when somebody had jumped out in front of the bus and nearly got run over.
The bus had a CCTV camera that had captured Caroline walking in the road.
You could see from the footage that she was shaky, she was unsteady on her feet, and she appeared to be drunk and very vulnerable.
The area where the girl had run in front of the bus was quite close to Thornywood Mount. Looking down there's two premises, one on either side of the road, that had got good CCTV. Looking at it at the relevant times, I can see a girl come across on that side of the road, across the mouth of the drive.
She starts to trot, so she's clearly beginning to move quicker than normal as she gets halfway through the junction.
And she's closely pursued by a man.
What I knew from the outset was that the offender was no more than sort of 10 yards behind her.
With a potential suspect and the victim Caroline caught on CCTV, the team began to widen their search.
She goes down the road in the direction of where later we find the body. He's in pursuit of her. It's difficult to tell, but she's walking very quickly and he's walking very quickly. There's another camera across the road. When you look at that, you see that the girl has now crossed over to that side of the road, which is the same side as where the house was, where she was found.
She crossed the road from here. What we then see is an image of the offender looking across the road towards her. It was abundantly obvious that whoever the man was the person that was going to follow Caroline into Thornywood Mount and subsequently attack her.
It's very common for this type of rapist, the rapist who is using the act as a substitute for a relationship, to begin by stalking. It's quite common for them to identify someone, generally somebody who's about their own age, and to stalk them, to follow them, to observe them.
Having tracked the suspect to the place where the body was found, Pauline began to look for CCTV of him leaving.
Well, where does he go from there? Some CCTV's been collected from premises across the road from there. I see somebody very similar walk past. It's good footage, but it's black and white. But there's something about it that made you think that it was very suspicious about this person. And he's then seen crossing the road on some footage from the corner shop, which then means he's moving down towards the Carlton area.
But then the man disappears from view. They have a prime suspect, but don't know who he is.
Having secured this footage, it was really significant. We would have huge conversations as a team about what we could do with that footage, and we made a decision to release the footage of the offender.
With any murder, we're very keen to help the police with the investigations. So at this time, police were appealing for witnesses. And there was also an evening where the police went out with an image of a suspect they wanted to speak to on the side of a van, went around the streets, and they're just raising awareness, really. I'm sure the officers spoke to the residents in the street to see if they'd heard anything. So, very high profile at the time. Very full-on policing, very good police work.
While Pauline continued to play through hours of footage looking for both Caroline and the suspect, the rest of the team kept searching for physical evidence.
Our initial reaction to this investigation was because of that sexual motive. We believed that a very dangerous individual was out there. On this occasion, we kept all lines of inquiry open.
We did lots of inquiries around where her shoe may have gone. We looked in all the gardens here. We did some checkings of roofs and waste ground, but we never found it. I did wonder whether the offender had actually taken it as a trophy.
It became frustrating that you can't identify the offender, but you know that you're getting closer to it, and if you keep going, you're going to hopefully find him.
In Nottingham, the body of Caroline Coyne had been found outside a house. She had been attacked by a man who had followed her after a night out.
Caroline Coyne, she was 28, just turned 28. She was a care worker. A young lady, she had some partners, she had a couple of children, very, very close to her family.
When you have a young woman who's clearly been killed by a stranger, it is always sad. But equally sadly, the nature of the injuries, what happened to her, is very typical of many of the assaults we see.
The police had found images of Caroline and her attacker on CCTV, but had no further leads.
The priorities are to see what her last movements are, how she ended up where she did.
So on the night of Caroline Coyne's death, she had been drinking at a family party. It was an address just across the park area here behind me. She'd had a minor sort of dispute and decided to leave the party. She went to a local off-licence, got a bottle of alcohol, and then she came here to this park with her half-sister. And one of the things we know is she was playing on this zip wire. We know that she fell off. And there was a time when the two of them had a conversation about going back home. And for whatever reason, Caroline said, no, I'm going somewhere else. And the two parted.
Police appealed to the public for information about any possible sightings of Caroline.
We knew what time she'd moved on from her half-sister. We then got her on Porchester Road on CCTV.
She was trying to flag cars down, she was trying to get into a taxi, she got into a taxi, she got out again, she didn't pay the fare.
We'd also got two further reports. One was from two police officers. They actually had Caroline in the back of their police car. She was in the road, they stopped their car, she gets in uninvited. She asked them if she could be taken home.
They told her that they weren't a taxi service. She didn't appear to be drunk as such. She was confident to them. She smelled of alcohol.
And they told her that that's not what police officers are allowed to do. We don't do that. So they acted within the policy of Nottinghamshire Police, but they did direct her further up the road to where there was a taxi rank.
Caroline didn't get a taxi. She headed towards Thornywood Mount, where she encountered her attacker.
We know roughly where she's come from. Then we know when I went to see where he's come from. So I look at footage on Woodbury Road, as it joins Mapley Top, and I find some more footage of him coming up another road, going in the direction of Porchester Road. So there's a good chance it may be him. There's not many other people about at that time.
The image of the male, and it clearly was a male, was very, very difficult to unravel because the man was very, very nondescript. His coat was up, a hood was up.
Despite having lots of images of the killer on CCTV, the police were no closer to identifying him. They began to search through the records of known criminals.
We looked at all manner of sexual attacks, and there was nothing similar to this in the weeks and months before this particular attack happened.
With appeals for public information still out there, exactly 1 month after the attack on Caroline, they got a break.
We got a call into the investigation room to say that another female had been attacked in similar circumstances to what we believed had happened to Caroline. So we then took on the investigation side of that sexual assault.
A 21-year-old woman called Jessica had been attacked at 4 a.m.
Jessica Price said she'd actually been on a shopping trip with some friends, but had become detached from her friends, and it was very, very late at night when she actually began to make her way home. Unfortunately, she decided to walk all the way home, a long way out of the city.
I went to see Jessica and quickly established that the nature of her attack and the way she was as a person, she was very credible, she was very willing to assist the police. Jessica wouldn't normally walk home alone at that time in the morning, but as she'd run out of money, that was her only option. So she walked up Carlton Road. She became very aware of a person walking behind her and closing in on her.
As she's leaving the city, she is propositioned by a male. She preempts that by turning and seeing him and saying, "What's the time?" Almost immediately upon sharing the time with him, she was attacked from behind, dragged across the road, up an alleyway, onto some steps of a college where there was a clear intent to sexually assault her and even rape her.
As Jessica was struggling to breathe, she managed to get the offender to release one of his hands, at which point she could talk to him, say to him, "Why did you do that? Why are you doing this? What's happening?" Very brave actions, but somehow she did it in a way that the offender listened to her and then started to engage with her.
How she did it, and I've spoken to her on many occasions, I have no idea. But she had the presence of mind to put a stop to that, but not using physical violence, by just using her voice and her conversational skills to make him stop, to make him think about what he was doing. And the attack stopped.
Jessica was very, very wary of trying to run off because she knew the offender would be able to overpower her. So her decision making was to stay friendly with this offender and walk together with this offender as friends in the direction of her home address.
Just imagine how difficult that must be, but she did. But that meant that she had to hold his hand, for example. We had subsequently CCTV footage of her attacker, even though he was holding her hand, still pulling her and taking her and trying to drag her away from the main road into alleyways and little quiet spots near shops and things like that. But she kept on talking to him, "Let's stay on the main road, let's stay on the main road, let's share a cigarette."
The fact that they walked away from the initial scene of the attack holding hands, in Jessica's words, it was almost like he believed she was his girlfriend. And I think it was the fact that she was playing a role that he wanted her to play, either deliberately or inadvertently. She played this role that actually meant that his fantasy was fulfilled. And that's why Jessica was saved from further attack.
Jessica walked along Carlton Road with the offender, having some conversation, acutely aware that at some point she would have to make some excuses and make her way home. She told the offender that her mother was expecting her, that she was up waiting for her, and she used this opportunity to then say to the suspect, "Can we exchange telephone numbers and can we do this another time?"
Pretending that she would see him again, Jessica gave her attacker her phone number and then slowly walked off. As soon as she got home, she rang the police.
Looking at what had happened to Jessica and knowing the location was not too far from where we'd discovered Caroline's body, we immediately thought there were similarities in both those cases, that we could be dealing with the same offender.
She didn't have a name, but she gave us a very, very good description, including a tattoo that he had on his hand. So I had a lot of detail around it. The fact that you may have possibly got closer to your offender is, of course, massively important. The fact that you haven't caught your offender before he's had the opportunity to attack a second female is really, really not good. You know, I've talked to Jessica about it, and I wish that didn't happen. But absolutely, because it did happen, it was massively significant in the investigation in relation to what happened to Caroline Coyne.
Thanks to Jessica, the team now had a much better description of the man they suspected of killing Caroline.
She described him in quite significant detail. He had on similar type of clothing on that evening as he had on during the attack of Caroline Coyne. She described him as somebody that she thought had a mixed-race heritage but was extremely light-skinned.
Jessica was also able to help the police find more evidence.
Jessica Price, during the attack, which was horrendous, showed such strength of character that she, post the events of the attack, was able to take two officers back to the bus stop where she had shared a cigarette with the attacker and knew exactly which cigarette they'd discarded on the floor.
From the cigarette butt found at the scene, the DNA could have been extracted from the dried saliva and a characteristic profile could have been created.
As the forensic team waited to see if the DNA would give them a name, an informant came forward with the name of a known criminal from the area. Tony asked his analysis to look into it and see if he could be the man seen on CCTV.
So then when we get a name and we begin to look at that name, we think, that's not quite right, but it could be very, very similar.
Tony and his analyst looked for a similar sounding name on the long list of potential offenders they had drawn up.
Amongst all those hundreds of names that we had, Carl Powell was on that list. That's when he comes and says, I've looked closely at Carl Powell and I think it's him. And then I look at Carl Powell's image and I look at the CCTV image of the offender for Jessica Price. And it's Carl Powell.
Tony had a suspect, but needed more evidence to link him to the attack on Jessica.
Now I'm saying, what about the DNA that we've set off? When's that going to come?
Shortly after the offence, the cigarette end had been sent for analysis and it came back with the DNA on it.
And it took about 2 hours and they came back with the answer. And I got the name Carl Powell.
Jessica Price had been attacked in Nottingham on Wednesday the 24th of August 2011. Now it was Friday, and suddenly the team had a prime suspect. A man named Carl Powell.
The attack on Jessica was very, very similar to what we believe had happened to Caroline Coyne. The offender had been predatory in that nature, and there was a sexual element to it. These two locations where Jessica had been attacked and where we knew Caroline had been found were very, very close, perhaps within less than half a mile between each location. So we strongly suspected Carl Powell had been involved in the Caroline Coyne investigation.
Senior Investigating Officer Tony was about to go public with information about the attack on Jessica, so needed to decide his next move quickly.
I decide that I'm going to arrest Carl Powell, but I'm going to arrest him the following morning. So we decided to go ahead with this media release, but we also put out a lot of extra patrols because I could not run the risk that Carl Powell, having just attacked Jessica Price, might do something again that night, and I was very, very nervous about that.
It looked like the team had found their killer. Officers were sent out to arrest Powell and bring him to the station.
Carl Powell was arrested in the early hours of the 27th of August. That was the Saturday morning after we did all the media releases. He was asleep at his girlfriend's address and he was arrested on suspicion of the attack on Jessica Price initially. Clearly we had a lot more evidence there. We had the cigarette. We searched all of his home. We found what we subsequently identified as the clothing that he had on during the night of the attack on Caroline Coyne.
As officers arrested Powell, CCTV investigator Pauline was searching footage of the hours before the attack, looking for him.
When we'd got the name of Carl, started looking at him, obviously he was interviewed in relation to the assault on Jessica, and any information that he came up with or what he was saying, then I would either try to confirm or prove wrong by looking at further CCTV to get to know what his movements were and if he could be the same offender as for Caroline.
The footage was able to place Powell in the area of the attack on Caroline some hours before.
Some of the inquiry then moved to Sherwood, public house there, where we could see him approaching the public house, broad daylight, going into the public house and in there mixing with people, talking with people, coming out for a cigarette. I could match that with the person that I could see who'd attacked Carolyn. One of the things was the bag he was carrying. I was quite happy that that was him.
Once we charged Powell with murder, it was my job to inform the family that we'd charged Carl and that he was going to court. The family were very, very relieved to hear that we'd caught somebody who we believed was responsible for Caroline's death.
Powell, however, was still claiming he had nothing to do with the attack. The police had to gather as much evidence as they could, linking him to the location of the murder.
In relation to the amount of footage taken, there were in excess of 330 items from approximately 100 different locations.
He, on both accounts, both attacks, wasn't going to contest that it was him that we had some CCTV footage of. Now that's interesting as an investigator. You've got an individual that's not phased to say, yes, that was me, I was around at the time with both of these attacks, but let me tell you, I didn't attack either of these females. It was only when we showed him the footage in its entirety, how he had followed her in, been out of shot and then running back, that he then decided, I don't think I want to speak to the officers anymore, conducting the interviews.
In the following weeks, Carl Powell went to court to register his pleas in relation to both the attack on Jessica Price and the murder of Caroline Coyne.
He denied any wrongdoing in both offences. After that, we'd remanded him, he stayed in custody, and then he appeared at Nottingham Crown Court on various occasions until finally his trial begun about 12 months later.
The first time I saw Carl Powell actually was at Nottingham Crown Court when he stepped into the dock and was addressed by his name, and the picture of the man stood there. He was someone who's quite soft features, quite baby-faced, someone quite young really, so I don't really know if you can have an image of a person who would murder somebody because every murder is different, but he just seemed quite clean-cut and not capable of doing something like this.
On the 2nd of October 2012, the trial began.
Every day it was on television and in the local paper, it was in the national papers. It was quite a big thing at the time.
Carl Powell pleaded not guilty to both offences.
We'd set up a full trial where all our witnesses in the murder and the sex assault on Jessica were called to court. Jessica herself went to court and was immensely brave and courageous in standing in the box and giving her evidence.
He just grabbed me from behind by the neck and started sort of trying to drag me across the road. He terrified me to begin with, and I don't know what would have happened if he had held my neck down for a lot longer, because there was a good period of time where I couldn't breathe.
I think the evidence given by Jessica Price was very good. She was given a hard time in the witness box. She remained very calm.
Police showed the court that Powell had been looking for someone to attack that night.
With the CCTV, prior to Jessica being attacked, on that evening he'd gone into town and he was approaching women.
The evidence was so compelling that you could see members of the jury believing exactly what Jessica had said. Throughout this, Powell was looking around the court very arrogant.
We did see CCTV in court of him actually talking to her, so it's quite a sinister image of him considering what he'd done just a month earlier. He was really just trying to sort of persuade her to go with him, so she was extremely lucky.
The police were able to prove that Carl and Jessica had met via the DNA recovered from the cigarette, but they had no similar evidence linking him to Caroline.
One of the things that made the case even more difficult to solve was the fact that we had no DNA, no forensic evidence of Caroline's body. However, we knew that Powell had been wearing gloves that night, and we suspect they had gloves on at the time of attacking Caroline.
During the trial, I showed the CCTV, and then I had to give evidence in the witness box in relation to what I'd shown.
But the main evidence was that he was there in that area at the time, and when you saw all the different clips together, although a lot of it's circumstantial evidence, it did put him in that location at that time.
Powell was very arrogant and seemed to think that he'd done nothing wrong and that he'd be cleared of any wrongdoing.
He did give evidence and he did deny the offence, and he said that he was in that area at the time because he heard these noises. I think it was a car horn, there was some screeching, so he went to go and have a look and he was being nosy. So that would explain why he was in that area at that time.
Throughout the trial, Powell's defence team continued to plead his innocence and attempted to prove Caroline had not been murdered.
Carl Powell's defence, we knew from the outset, was going to be, I wasn't the person that followed Caroline Coyne all the way down into Thornwood Mount. I didn't sexually assault her. I wasn't responsible for her injuries. And in relation to Jessica Price, we did have some sexual contact, but it was consensual, and she's either making it up or she's lying.
The defence team went on to say that Caroline had died from injuries she had got when she was drunk.
One of the complications that arose was she was supposed to have been in a play park and to have bumped her head. That is a potential explanation for a head injury. But in her case, the magnitude of that impact to the head was not in keeping with the magnitude of the injury to the brain, and the sort of direct damage to the brain was such that she would have been unconscious, if not dead, after that. She would not have been walking around for 2-3 hours, albeit inebriated, and on that basis you can pretty much rule out that as the significant event.
The prosecution was able to counter all Powell's arguments with the police evidence.
The Crown Court trial lasted 3 weeks, in which time we presented our prosecution case to the jury, and the fact that we believe Powell was a dangerous individual who was out late at night, predominantly target young, vulnerable women for the purposes of a sex assault.
I felt very confident about the evidence that we were presenting, that there was enough, certainly with the CCTV, to convict him of both of the offences.
So the jury went out and considered all the evidence, and they came back and found him guilty of murder and assault with intent to commit a sexual offence and sexual assault on the second victim.
The judge then goes out and came back in, and in this circumstances he sentenced Carl Powell to a minimum of 20 years. So it's 20 years before Carl Powell can even think about approaching a parole board. Is it long enough? I don't know. But the people that really feel it are the family, and they were content, but of course they're not happy. Caroline Coyne's died. Jessica Price, she's gone through all of that. She's moved on, her life's moved on, but Caroline Coyne, she's not here.
I believe that had Jessica not engaged with Powell at the time of being strangled, unable to breathe, in fear for her life, that she would have come to a similar end to that Caroline came to.
Carl Powell was convicted and given a minimum tariff of 20 years. As somebody who's seen a lot of outcomes of murder trials, that is a long tariff. He will be in prison for a long time, and having seen what he did to Caroline, that is a good thing.
Meredith Grey and all the favourites are back. Prep the OR. Watch the season premiere of Grey's Anatomy on Catch Up TV from Sky Witness.
What you have is a young lady who is in a suitcase which has been deposited on a railway embankment, covered over by twigs and other foliage.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
And then you find out what really happened. You read it in books, you see it in TV shows and everything else. It's really tough.
It tears communities apart.
You can still speak to residents now, and they say they've never got over it, what happened to a young man in the midst of their little community here.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
That was our hope, that where we were going was going to provide us with a treasure chest of information.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
In this episode, a young athlete is shot dead on the street.
Sulu was the perfect guy. They called him the gentle giant. You get some moron driving by, he fires one shot and hits him right in the face. Kills him right there, boom.
Meet the murder detectives.
Without this young girl calling, I wouldn't really have had much to do other than possibly eat a donut or have some coffee.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
I was trying to figure out why you shot him, you know?
Keep your voice down.
In the Central Valley of California, surrounded by farmland and almost 100 miles east of San Francisco, lies the city of Modesto. On March 19th, 1994, a 22-year-old man was shot dead in the road by a gunman in a passing car.
This murder happened on a Saturday morning, an early Saturday morning, a little after 2 a.m. And I had gone to work Friday morning at 7 o'clock, and I was getting ready to go home when they said, no, not so fast, we've got something else for you. And they said a murder investigation had just started on Orangeburg Avenue, and they sent me over there.
John Bueller was the detective in charge. He headed downtown to the scene of the shooting.
When I got here that night, of course, the street lights were going, and I could see rather good, but I had to park down around the corner because they had the yellow crime scene tape up that was keeping all traffic out, so there was nobody driving through here. And so when I walked in, I went by one of the uniformed officers, he signed me into the crime scene, and I walked up towards us, coming up from behind me. The other detectives had arrived before me, and they were already starting. And I quickly caught up with what was going on, which really wasn't difficult because there wasn't much to catch up on. In this case, it was right on the sidewalk where the shooting had occurred, and the shot had been fired from the street in the lane going in the opposite direction. So the shot came across 3 lanes of traffic as the car was in motion.
Detective Dick Rydenor was John's second in command. The victim had been identified, but as yet, very little was known about him.
I heard that the guy was a basketball player, and he was here doing some kind of show thing at a church, and that he was walking over off of Orangeburg Avenue, and somebody came by and shot him in a drive-by shooting.
The victim had been with 2 friends who told officers he was called Sulu Palega. The 3 of them had been in a convenience store buying some food. Darrell Farnsworth, a local journalist, picked up the story.
Sulu was like the perfect guy. They called him the gentle giant. I guess he was about 6'4", 6'5", 250 pounds, and he was in a Christian basketball tournament. That's why he was here to begin with. And then you get some moron driving by. He fires one shot from the rear seat of the car and hits him right in the face. Kills him right there, boom.
It was a shock to everyone involved that Sulu had been shot in this part of town.
I know Orangeburg Avenue because I live pretty close to over there. It's got a couple of motels, got some eating restaurants. Not a problem of any particular kind. So it's actually not a bad area.
I couldn't believe that he was shot where he was shot. They were walking back to their motel, and it's just the last place you think somebody would kill you.
For John and his team, this area had become a crime scene. And as such, they needed to search for any evidence that might lead to Sulu's killer.
Just about any time a detective goes to a murder scene, we're kind of the late ones getting there. Usually the first people there are the uniformed officers in the police cars, and then, of course, the ambulance personnel. But in this case, they wanted to save Sulu. They wanted to save his life. So they cut his clothes off partially to get some vital signs, and they loaded him in the ambulance quickly and took him to a nearby hospital. By the time I got to the scene, I already learned that Sulu had passed away, that he had died from his wound.
John and his team examined what had been found at the location of the shooting.
And one of the officers had circled with tire crayon, it's like a yellow crayon for marking tires, he had circled a little thing in the middle of the street over here in the turn lane. And I walked over there because they had told me what it was, but I just confirmed it was that 10mm shell casing from the pistol. There were no witnesses that could give us any specific detail about the car. I knew our best shot at getting any type of information was going to be from Sulu's two companions.
Sulu and his two friends, Michael and Anthony, had arrived from San Francisco and knew nobody in town.
What I learned from both Michael and Anthony was horrifying. They had left their motel earlier and had wanted to get some snacks at a nearby convenience store. Sulu and Michael and Anthony were walking towards us, but they were on the other side of the street. Now, as they were approaching us, they were coming from the north, which is where the convenience store was, where they'd picked up their snacks. So they were on the other side of the street coming towards us, because behind me, around the curve, is the motel where they were staying at just down the road there. So all walking distance, easy walking distance. It was around the same time that the bars and the nightclubs were closing. So it was about 2 a.m. And as they were walking down, they had no idea that this was coming to them. But they heard somebody yell, "Hey," from a passing car. Michael and Anthony and Sulu turned to look like, who's yelling at us? And that's when he stuck the gun out the window and fired that one unaimed shot that could have gone anywhere. It could have gone across the freeway into the buildings. It could have gone into a tree, a bush, the sidewalk. It could have gone anywhere, but it didn't. That bullet went to Sulu's eye, and that's what killed him instantly, right across the street from where we are right now, taking him away from us.
John learned more about Sulu from his two friends.
Sulu was one of those unique people that was pretty pure person through and through. He came from a great family in San Francisco. He was down in Modesto just by chance playing in a charity Christian basketball tournament.
The charity basketball tournament had been organised by the Modesto Church. One of its leaders was Ginny.
The basketball rally was formed originally to help kids have something to do to keep them off the street. And it was just unfortunate that something like this had to happen when a team from out of town was here.
They were told about the shooting the following day.
And they told us that the fellow from San Francisco had been killed in a drive-by shooting, and I think I was speechless.
The detectives had very little to build on to solve this case, but they had years of experience behind them.
We knew John Bueller. He was a best friend to one of our neighbor boys growing up. We had a lot of respect for him.
John had investigated many murders, but Sulu's was different.
For a policeman, this was a great town to work in because there was always something happening, there was always something interesting, but unfortunately, everything that was interesting and everything that was happening usually had some tragedy attached to it.
Understanding the life of the victim is something that the police will always do as part of their investigation. That'll be the starting point. And that's why when there's no relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, that makes that difficult, because where's the link?
It didn't sound from the early information that I had that he was engaged in any horseplay or any type of activity that would contribute to him being shot.
He wanted to be a fireman. He was very religious. He was just the kind of guy, if you had a sister or something like that, you would want her to date.
The night of the shooting, the investigation had only just begun, but with no witnesses. John only had one lead.
The best thing that I had going were the two friends that were with Sulu when he was shot. And I was hoping that they would know there was some connection.
John asked the friends to painstakingly talk through every moment before and after the shooting.
They didn't have a good description of the car. They didn't have a license number on the car. They didn't have a description of the occupants of the car. And they couldn't even tell me the make of the car. And they weren't even much help on the color. They described a darker color, but they couldn't even zero in on that. So they told me what happened, but they didn't have specifics that would really help us.
The first few hours are key in any murder investigation. But in this case, detectives still had very little to work on.
It's getting early morning hours, close to 6 in the morning by the time we finished up. And of course, like anybody who's been up for nearly 24 hours, I was tired at the time. But the one thing about cases like this is you can't stop gathering information that you might lose because you're tired. So you have to keep working.
This is probably one of the most difficult murder cases to investigate because there's very little to go on. There's going to be a lot of obstacles in the police's way investigating this type of case, and they have to rely on kind of good old-fashioned policing.
Well, you have to be dedicated to the job. You have to turn every rock. So you just got to keep digging and digging and digging.
There didn't seem to be any obvious motive as to why these three guys had been targeted.
This case was shocking because it was so brazen. It was in public, it was at night, and it was not showing any particular reason. There was nothing logical about this case on why this guy, why at this time, and why at this location would he be targeted.
John and his team were now desperately looking for anything that could give them a lead to finding the killer.
It's the only evidence I had. One shell casing, clothing that wasn't going to help me, and a pool of blood on the side of the road. And of course, at that time, it just made me think, we're probably not going to solve this. It didn't mean we weren't going to work it. It didn't mean we weren't going to try hard and give it everything we had. But I didn't have the things that I've seen in other murder cases that puts you in a mindset from the start knowing this is solvable, we can find this guy. We didn't have that here.
In Modesto, California, in the early hours of Saturday morning, San Francisco basketball player Sulu Palega had been shot in the eye and killed by someone driving by.
At 10:30 in the morning on Saturday morning, 8 hours after Sulu had been shot, we really didn't have anything to go on.
Lead detective John Bueller was struggling to find a motive for the killing.
I wished I would have had a different type of crime scene. I didn't have that. It would have been nice if I would have had some witness. I didn't have that. Because if I don't have a witness and I don't have physical evidence that will help me determine who the killer is, it's a real whodunit, and we just have to rely on luck at that point to solve it.
I don't think people had any theories. They were just in shock, wondering, how could this happen? And to this guy? This guy's not a gangbanger or anything like that as we started putting out information about him.
We knew that Sulu's family had been notified by the San Francisco authorities, so there was no reason for us to go up there at that time. I left that morning not too optimistic that this case was going to be solved.
As soon as the police arrived at the scene, they were probably assuming that it was a gang-related situation. They were probably assuming that when they found out who the person was, they were going to identify, what was going on. When they looked into his background, they would have been really surprised that he would have been the victim. So very quickly, they would have determined that it was a case of mistaken identity.
It was big news in Modesto. Everybody was following it, wondering who could have done it. I mean, car drives by slow, guys from out of town, which was surprising, because we have shootings and drive-by shootings.
If it was difficult for the police to understand how Sulu had become the victim of a shooting that night, it was even harder for his parents.
His mother did not want him to come to Modesto that weekend. I don't know if she had a premonition or just what, and that really hurt when I heard that. I have daughters, and I can't even imagine.
Detective John Bueller had been working all night, and mid-morning on Saturday he headed home for some rest.
I was probably home in bed by 11:30, then got up late that afternoon, showered, and I was going to go back down to the office. But it was when I was getting ready to go into work that I learned that this girl had called and wanted to talk to me about this murder. And that was the one break that we needed to start going in the right direction.
A woman called the police station claiming that she believed the killer had come to her house in the early hours of the morning.
She saw on the television news the reporting of the young basketball star that was shot in a drive-by shooting in Modesto. So she immediately connected what had happened at 3 a.m, about 14 hours earlier, with what she was hearing on the TV at that time. She picked up the phone, she called Modesto Police Department, and then I got the call to come and meet her.
The first 48 hours of the investigation, things started clicking because that lady had called and said, hey, I think I know somebody you might want to talk to.
Witnesses are hugely important to homicide investigations, and I think people perhaps don't realise how valuable they still are because we have so much science and technology.
This is the building that used to have the restaurant called the Sizzler. Now, the Sizzler restaurant was where the waitress worked that gave us the break that made this case. And what she told me was that earlier that morning, about 3 a.m, not even an hour after the murder happened, a guy named Bobby came to her house. He had 2 friends with him, and he wanted her to get in her car and take Bobby and his 2 friends back to recover something. Well, she kind of liked Bobby. She'd met him before. She knew him from the bars in Modesto. So they got into her car and they drove back down the road a few miles south of here. And at the side of the road there was a kiwi stand. And there in the bushes by that kiwi stand was a gun in a gun case, a handgun. Bobby got back in the car with his handgun, and this waitress recognized what it was immediately. And because of that, she started getting fearful. Well, as she continued to drive, she heard the boys talking about, I hope I killed the right guy, I hope I shot the right guy, things like this. Now she was starting to get worried.
The woman believed that Bobby was hoping she'd help him dispose of the gun.
But when they got to this young girl's house, she told them, you can get in your car and leave, I don't want to be a part of this. To which they got out of her car, got in Bobby's car, and then left.
Any logical person who was thinking about disposing of a firearm would try and dispose of it in another way to make sure that it was safely disposed of, whether it was thrown into a lake or a river or something. But to give possession of it to someone else who you didn't know was an extremely risky tactic. And in this case, it backfired because that person was the one that reported it to the police.
The witness was keen to give John as much information as she could to track down Bobby.
In talking to this waitress, she couldn't give me the last name, and that's the one thing that I really, really needed. So it was a situation where she could only remember something that related to the name. She told me the name sounded maybe French, it might have had an L or an S in it, or it might have reminded her of a fish or something like that. She knew that he'd been laid off or fired from a job at some pay and pack or pack and save, some sort of business up there in the Bay Area, but she didn't really have any other details that would help us. In addition to Bobby making claims about hoping that he had shot the right guy, there was also some small talk that was a bit disjointed and not really complete, involving Bobby doing this shooting as a retaliation because he had been shot at a night or two earlier before the shooting while down in Modesto.
My understanding is that the night before, he had been in an argument with a guy over another girl that he was trying to date, and they both liked, and some guy fired some shots over his head to warn him to leave him alone.
This was certainly a big break in the case, because at this point, without this young girl calling, I wouldn't really have had much to do other than possibly eat a donut or have some coffee.
John now had another lead to chase down, the girl involved in the argument between Bobby and another guy. They believe she worked in the diner chain, Denny's, and it was her friend who had fired a shot at Bobby.
Then we drove back to Modesto. We wanted to go to that Denny's restaurant, and as luck would have it, we got there, and we found a waitress that knew of Bobby, but she also confirmed for us that she'd gotten in an argument with this Bobby.
John now compiled all the info he had on Bobby, in the hope of finding him.
There were enough small details, such as the L and the S in his name, and that it sounded French, and it reminded somebody of a fish, and that he worked at this store, and he got laid off for fighting.
Bobby's ex-place of work was their best lead so far. Tracking it down became their number one priority.
He was unemployed, I think, at the time of the shooting. He had worked at a pack and save somewhere.
Well, in 1994, it wasn't really too difficult to figure out how many pack and save stores there were in the South Bay area of San Francisco. And so we were able to just look those up in a directory, and we just started calling the different stores. The Sunnyvale Pack and Save was the next store that we called, and luckily we got a hold of a manager there that knew of Bobby and knew that he'd been laid off for fighting with another employee. So he was able to give us information about Bobby's identity, his true name, his address, his phone number, and his date of birth from the employment records.
It looked like the team had now found their suspect.
What we found out is that the guy Bobby was actually Bobby Lesturgeon, Lesturgeon. Now, Lesturgeon can kind of sound French with the Lee part, and a sturgeon, of course, is a fish. That's where they get caviar. So, Bobby Lesturgeon, it fit exactly with what both the waitresses said.
A picture was emerging of Bobby's life, and why he was in Modesto the night of Sulu's shooting.
Lesturgeon, Bobby, Robert, whatever they call him, he lived over in San Jose, and he would come to Modesto to go to the bars and try and pick up women here.
John tracked down Bobby's driving license, which had a photo on it. They had their man.
And we showed that photo to the waitress from the steak restaurant, and she immediately recognized that was Bobby. And even though the photo didn't have his name on it, she said, yeah, that's absolutely him. So we asked her if she would mind if we were able to put a phone recorder on her telephone. And that way, if he called, she would be able to record the calls. And she said, certainly. She agreed to that without hesitation. And I asked her, I said, well, do you think he will call? And she said, well, if I page him, he'll call.
The trap was set. If John and the team could get Bobby on the phone talking about the shooting, they would have all the evidence they needed to arrest him. They hoped they were now tantalizingly close to catching Sulu's killer. In downtown Modesto, California, 22-year-old basketball player Sulu Palega from San Francisco had been shot dead in a motiveless drive-by shooting.
When there is a murder that goes unexplained and it goes unanswered, that's what shocks our community. Because most murders are husbands, wives, most domestic.
He was only in Modesto to compete in a church basketball festival.
you're just in shock. You're kind of numb. You just don't know what to say, you know. He was one of our basketball players, so that was important.
2 local waitresses had helped police identify the killer, a man named Bobby Lesturgeon, from nearby Livermore.
It didn't seem like Bobby and his 2 friends were gangsters or somebody that does drive-by shootings frequently. It was hard to know for sure, but the mere fact that Bobby didn't turn off either of these 2 waitresses and they seemed somewhat interested in him showed that he might have had some good tendencies and he might have been boyfriend material. But, of course, what he did kind of took him out of that category.
Detective John Bueller and his team had convinced one of the waitresses to get in contact with Bobby and record her phone calls, hoping he would discuss the murder.
Once they get a suspect like that and they have somebody they know, they tap the line and have the witness call the person and try and get them to give themselves up, not knowing, of course, that the police are listening in.
The witness was clearly critically important to that investigation, and the police peers wouldn't have known where to begin had that witness not come forward.
True to her word, the waitress paged Bobby, and when he called her back, she recorded the call.
How you doing? Fine, how are you? Yeah, I'm here. Oh.
She'd paged Bobby, and of course he responded. And he called back, and they got in a conversation.
You any better? Yeah, a lot better. The last time we talked? Yeah, I guess that's just that day. I guess.
He didn't tell her everything yet, but she started asking him what went on the other night. Why did you come to my house?
You told him that either? No, I didn't say nothing. Why? What am I going to tell him? Well, yeah, he had to come over. He saw somebody.
What were you doing with the gun and what's going on? And of course, by this time, she knew that he'd done the shooting. And so he started giving bits of information that only somebody who had done the shooting would know.
I just couldn't figure out, I was trying to figure out why you shot him, you know?
And over the next several days, what it revealed is that the shooting was done because it was a mistaken identity. Bobby had actually been looking for the guy that had shot at him the prior night, on that Thursday night after he'd got in the argument with the Denny's waitress.
Because, I told her I'm looking for them. So then we took off and went somewhere else, and then we drove back by Denny's, and there's these dudes standing off, and when we drove by, they put their hands out, and they're like, what's up?
I listened to the recording. The guy basically admitted that he did it.
They now had Bobby's account of what had happened that Friday night.
Bobby is driving past in his car, going the opposite direction away from us. Sulu, along with Michael and Anthony, are walking towards us. And it was at that time that Bobby saw Sulu and thought he was the guy that had shot at him a couple of nights earlier. So he didn't want to let this guy get away with it. So he continued on up the road here until he got to a large discount store. Now, that store was closed at 2 o'clock in the morning, but Bobby pulled into the parking lot, which was vacant. There was nobody around. Bobby gets out of the car, goes to the trunk, gets the gun, puts a magazine in it, runs the slide back, chambers around, gets in the back seat behind the driver.
So then we went around, and I got my gloves on and got my out the trunk and got in the back seat. We drove back by, and they were still there. Right when we came around the corner, they saw my car, and what's up? I said, what's up? And then I let one off, and I guess it hit him in the head. God.
He ended up shooting the gun, and it ended up hitting the one victim and killed him.
We got straight on the freeway, headed to your house. No, hold on, there's another line. Okay. Hi. Yeah.
Right off, that's the police phone. I got really tied up.
Yeah, guess what?
What?
He's on the other line.
Oh.
John and the team now had what was effectively a confession on tape.
Throughout all these phone calls, Bobby was still trying to romance her, wanting to get together and things like that. But as time went by, he freely talked about using a specialty gun with specialty ammunition, and that the gun is already destroyed. They'd thrown it off a bridge or gotten rid of the gun, and it was already gone.
It's gone. Gone. That's why you use a gun like that.
She had also told me that they were talking about going to New York City very soon. So we knew the time was getting limited as to what we had to do next.
They had to find Bobby and fast. John felt they had enough to arrest him for the murder of Sulu.
Bobby said that he was glad that he'd actually shot the wrong guy, because if he had shot the guy that he was going after, there would have been a connection. And that connection would have led detectives like us to Bobby. But because there was no obvious connection in any way between Sulu and Bobby, the chances of us solving that case were almost nil.
Throughout California, the drive-by shooting was starting to attract a lot of media interest, and the pressure was growing to catch the killer.
There were radio call-in shows in the San Francisco Bay Area that were talking about this case that happened 90 miles away in Modesto, because Sulu's family was so prominent, and Sulu was such a young, good guy that didn't contribute to this. People were calling into these radio shows saying that the guy who did this shooting should be killed himself.
People were calling and wishing I'd die. Slow and painful death.
So Bobby was feeling pressure from this. And as time went by, Bobby ended up getting involved in a hit-and-run traffic collision. He was in his girlfriend's car and he ran into a U.S. Postal Service truck. And then he took off. And it was at that time that we had to start accelerating our game plan to put together the arrests.
They knew Bobby lived in nearby Livermore, but as yet didn't have his address.
Now, in the tapes, we had learned from listening to the waitress that Bobby lived across the street from a fire station, because at one time in the tape you could hear sirens in the background when the waitress and Bobby were speaking.
It's not a real time to be thinking logically about things.
Oh, I hear sirens. What's that?
I live across the street from a fire station.
Oh, do you?
Yep.
The team also identified the addresses of the two other people who were in the car the night of the shooting. But John and Dick took on the job of going after Bobby.
But we were able to just sit out there and watch his house until he came out of the house.
Detective John Buehler decided they wanted to catch Bobby off guard and arrest him.
When we were there doing the stakeout, we got there early in the morning, I think about 5 o'clock, so hopefully Bobby was still in bed.
We sat there from early in the morning, about 6 in the morning, until about little after 10 o'clock, waiting for Bobby to come out.
When he came out of the house, we were not that far from him. We drew our guns, told him he was under arrest, and he didn't give us any trouble. Got him down on the ground, handcuffed him, and then we were able to put him in a patrol car.
John and Dick had their prime suspect in custody, and news quickly spread.
I was told about the arrest the day they made it. These guys work fast. They knew what they wanted to do, and they just go over and get him and brought him back and then started, interrogating him.
He thought we were postal inspectors and had caught him for that hit-and-run traffic collision. Now, a traffic collision is kind of important, but in the scale of comparison with a murder, a traffic collision is down here with no injuries, and the murder is right up here at the pinnacle. So we told Bobby then, well, we're not postal inspectors. We're Modesto homicide detectives. We showed him our badge, and you're under arrest for the drive-by shooting. The expression on his face changed instantly. I wish I could describe it, but there's limits on the English language that would put it into perspective. To say that he was shocked would be an understatement. And that was pretty much it.
Bobby was charged with the murder of Sulu. But he wasn't the only arrest made that morning. The police also went after the two passengers in the car, Mark and Vincent.
And at the same time we were doing that, we had a similar group of detectives that were going to do the same thing at Mark's house in Livermore. So as we did the simultaneous arrests and the search warrants, they went and had a stakeout going on Vince's house. And when he came out of his house and got in his car, that's when they grabbed him up also.
But with Bobby already denying everything, it was up to John to put together a case to prove murder. In Modesto, Californian detectives John Buehler and Dick Rydenor had arrested 3 suspects for the killing of basketball player Sulu Pelega. he was an innocent victim of a drive-by shooting.
Sometimes when we drive past there, I do think about it, but, it's always with compassion for Sulu and his family. Well, maybe God needed another good basketball player. In a time like this, you don't know. Our faith definitely helped us to get through each day.
The shooting had shaken up the whole city, especially as it seemed like a totally random killing.
Always a sense of relief when there's an arrest, especially in the community, because everybody follows it. We were a small community. We played the story up and everybody was interested, and when they did make the arrest, it's like, really, okay, it's nobody from Modesto.
The prime suspect, Bobby Lesturgeon, had been arrested outside his home several days after the shooting.
So he was transported to the police station, and we ended up meeting the other officers over there, and that's when we first decided to do the interview with him to see if he would talk to us. Not expecting whatsoever that he would, pretty much expecting that he wouldn't. We had him talking on tape about doing the murder, so we really didn't need an admission, although we would love that.
With the suspect, I pretty much just let him tell me about everything that was going on.
While Deputy Dick Rydner questioned Bobby, John had a new target in his sights.
It was that same afternoon after Bobby was arrested in Santa Clara that Dick Rydner and I returned here to this building. And when we went inside there, we found that the right front passenger that didn't do anything about shooting, didn't have anything to do with that, his name was Mark, he was inside the interview room in there, the same interview room where I'd interviewed Anthony and Michael.
John decided that in order to get Bobby behind bars for Sulu's murder, he'd make Mark an offer.
The offer that we talked about there with the district attorney's approval was that we would drop the charges that we had already sought against Mark in connection with this case, as long as he came forward, testified truthfully, gave us a complete statement, and would agree to testify in front of the jury in court. And as long as he fulfilled that stuff, we would dismiss the charges against him because he did not pull the trigger, he did not supply the gun, and he was much more valuable to us to make the case that much stronger.
Who better to tell you what happened than one of the other people that was there, that was involved, that went to the scene with the shooter, that drove the car, that has intimate knowledge of what happened, where, when and how. And of course there's a huge incentive for the suspect to cooperate with police, because then they are not going to go to prison for a very long time.
With Mark testifying against Bobby and the recorded confession, John was ready to go to court.
It went to trial. In fact, this guy is such a bad dude. It was a few days before his trial, or maybe even the day before, he and another inmate made an escape attempt from the jail. They took a guard hostage and held this jail-fashioned knife to his throat, cut him a little bit, and they were trying to get to the roof. They had some makeshift rope that they thought they could throw over the side. The jail staff was able to thwart that and take him into custody.
Once in the dock, Bobby was still pleading his innocence.
I think his defense was mistaken identity. That's the only thing he had, is he didn't mean to do it. He was trying to scare him. But, he hit the guy right in the face.
John didn't want to leave anything to chance, and had documented every stage of the investigation.
In America, generally we don't have the jury leave the courtroom during the trial. Sometimes it happens in a case depending on what the case is, but generally the jury is going to stay in the jury box in the courtroom for the length of the trial. But in this case, I didn't know how they would view this, and I didn't know how they could conjure this up in their head. So in addition to the hand-drawn diagram that we did of the street and the crime scene, I had the fire department come out here with one of their ladder trucks. Now the ladder will extend up about 75 feet. And so I got on that ladder dressed like this with a 35 millimeter camera, and I snapped a series of photographs from up high above to show the layout of the street, Sulu's motel, and the direction that Sulu and Michael and Anthony were coming from. So that way, in the jury, I could introduce those photos to the jury so they would actually see in photographs what it was like out there.
The killer piece of evidence, however, was the recordings made by the waitress, Bobby, had been trying to date.
We knew the tapes would be used in court and they would be accepted in court because it was legal for us to put the recorder on the waitress's phone. She agreed to it, she had knowledge of it, and that's all we needed in California when we were working a murder case to be able to make it legal.
Everything hung on these tapes, and the strategy also had other risks.
I listened to the tapes of these calls, and of course I had to turn the tapes in so that they could be transcribed so you could actually read the parts of the call and how it came about. And in all these phone calls with this young waitress, she was just a spectacular little actress.
That night was just an exception, I guess.
Oh, it's just an exception. So would you do it ever again?
What, shoot someone?
Yeah.
If I had to.
And she was kind of threatened a couple of times. Bobby had said words to the effect of, keep your mouth closed or I'll close it for you.
My friends would be pissed. Somebody snitched me out and I had to go to prison for life?
Yeah.
I feel very bad for that person.
Why? Like, what are you going to do to that person?
I wouldn't do nothing. I'd be in prison. I wouldn't do nothing.
He kind of made these implied threats that she better not cause any problems or she could end up the same way that Sulu did. But throughout all of it, she maintained her composure, she maintained her strength, and she maintained her patience and brought us some of the greatest stuff that we could have for this case.
Why? What are you going to do? Kill me like you did him?
Oh, that ain't cool. That ain't funny.
Often informants are targeted, witnesses in cases are targeted. So it does take a huge amount of bravery to give information to the police, to stand up, especially if you're then expected to go to court and stand there and give evidence. So this lady should be applauded for coming forward and giving that information to the police.
When Bobby's time in court came in May 1995, all the hard work paid off.
Well, in California, it's not unusual for there to be a year or so between the arrest and when somebody goes to trial. And in this case, that's what we had. The trial didn't take place until May of the following year. And, of course, it went for several days. But it wasn't a difficult decision, I don't think, for the jury because they didn't deliberate for too long. When you have the killer talking about the murder and you have it on tape and you play that in court, there really isn't much place for the killer to go. He's kind of stuck with that.
I'm sure someone's going to come around and get me soon. I'm sure I'll pay for this somehow, some way.
We didn't have any other information that was out there that would help the defense bring up some reasonable doubt. And that's really what they need to get a not guilty, is they just need to have one of those 12 jurors think that, no, I don't think he did it. But in this case, there really wasn't any reasonable doubt. And it wasn't because we did such great work. It's because of the things that the waitress did to help us and Bobby's own words. Those are the things that really made this case come together.
He pled not guilty at first, and then he was found guilty. They sentenced him to like 35 or 36 years. So he won't be getting out for a while. And if he does get out, he'll probably cause more problems.
With Sulu's killer behind bars, the Modesto church who ran the basketball tournament wanted to ensure that he was remembered by the community for the right reasons.
We came back the year after that because we did not want it to end on that kind of a note, and had a very good rally in 1995, and that was the last year.
In Sulu's hometown of San Francisco, the park where he had played basketball was named after him and opened by his father.
We finally named something after somebody that everybody knew, and this is Palega Park.
For John and the team, Sulu was more than just another murder case.
Sulu's case was unique because it was one of those somewhat rare cases where the victim had nothing to do with his murder. He didn't contribute to it. He didn't provoke it. He just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. We were lucky that we were able to find Bobby and determine who he was from the limited information we had. So at that point, it was a good outcome for a very, very tragic, senseless, wasteful murder.